Chapter 24 of The Heel of Achilles by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Oh, Mama, I quite forgot to tell you before. The casual note in Jenny's voice was overdone to an extent that must have awakened suspicion even in a listener far less acute than was Lydia. Well, he'd like to stop here just on his way back next week. He who? Lydia did not make this inquiry for the sake of obtaining information. She had no doubt whatever as to the identity of the forthcoming visitor, but Jenny was making her thoroughly uneasy, and she wished to test the grounds for the vexed anxiety that had now been with her for nearly a week. "Oh, didn't I say?" said Jenny, more elaborately casual than ever, and, picking up the kitten, began to try and make it bite its own tail. "I meant Billy's friend, the one who had the aeroplane." Lydia's mind automatically registered her daughter's avoidance of Mr. Roland Valentine's name. "Do you mean he wants to go to Quintmere again? I'm not at all sure that Grandmama would care to have him. He's not quite, well, not exactly a gentleman, is he?" "Oh, pussy kitten, you've scratched me!" cried Jenny in tones of reproach. "Not Quintmere, but here. He's going back to London, and he thought of getting out of the train at Clyst-Milton Junction and walking here, and then he could go on by the 3:30 from Ashlew. But he could go straight on to Exeter like anyone else does. What does he want to stop here for?" To break the journey," suggested Jenny feebly. "He's leaving the aeroplane at Plymouth." There was a silence, during which the kitten, inwardly approved by Lydia, made its escape. Deprived of this defense, Jenny lifted a very pink face and faced her mother. There was something at once defiant and childlike in her expression that secretly rather touched Lydia. "He really wants to see me, Mama. And I didn't think you'd mind, and when he suggested coming I asked him to have lunch. You always say you like me to have my friends here. Mama, you don't mind, do you?" "I don't mind anything so long as you're open with me, darling," said Lydia, making use of an unwanted term of endearment. "But I don't know that I altogether understand how you and this youth could have made friends in such a very short time." "Don't you?" said Jenny vaguely. She appeared to think that the conversation was ended. Lydia wished, as she had wished at ever-shortening intervals since Jenny's 9th year, that her daughter would confide in her, appeal to her. The protective instinct surged within her strongly. "Tell me, Jenny dear. I'll help you as much as I can." "There isn't anything to tell," said Jenny in the same vague, unsatisfactory manner. "He'll turn up on Tuesday, I should think. Ask Billy to come over if you like." "Oh, he'll be gone away by then, don't you remember?" said Jenny quickly. Lydia said nothing more. She was conscious of preoccupation during the rest of the week, and noticed for the first time that signs of care were beginning to show in her face, round her eyes and mouth. Several times she went with Jenny to the Mageys' untidy cottage, although the girl made no attempt to conceal the fact that she would have much preferred to make her visits there unaccompanied. Lydia listened with a little kindly smile to Mrs. Magey's incoherent declarations that Jackie was never so good with anybody as with the young lady, and quietly gave Mrs. Magey several hints from her own experiences as to the management of children. She also provided an occasional milk pudding or custard, and presently shared with her daughter in the voluble, incoherent gratitude of the slovenly woman. She also said to Jenny that it was a great pity that Jenny's old toys and picture books had been so maltreated and destroyed by a tomboyish owner that none of them could serve to cheer poor little Jackie's idleness now. There really was so very little to amuse a sick child. Lydia herself went and read stories aloud to the little boy from time to time, a kindness entirely beyond the compass of Jenny, who hated books, mispronounced many of her words in slipshod fashion, and gabbled like a schoolgirl. "I don't believe I'm good for anything except perhaps gardening," said Jenny in cross, resentful accents. "You would be good for a great deal, if you would only take pains and let yourself be taught," said Lydia serenely. She was far from disapproving of this most unwanted mood in her usually self-assertive daughter. It was quite true that Jenny was in no danger of displaying the efficiency that had been Lydia's at 19. She was very clumsy with her fingers, except when dealing with either plants or animals, and, although she was not stupid, a certain slowness of development and inability to express herself very often made her appear so. She could neither sew nor write with any facility, nor did she show any signs of having inherited her mother's business aptitude. These deficiencies should have made her very dependent upon Lydia, and the services that Lydia was only too ready to devote to her. But then Jenny did not like being served, although she would not take the steps towards learning such independence as might be conceded to a daughter in her mother's house. Perhaps she had not learnt these things young enough. A French governess had given her lessons, and had taught her French, far superior to the unsatisfactory amount assimilated by Lydia long ago at Miss Glover's school, but French was not in request at Sist Milton or Ashlew, and Jenny's proficiency was wasted after Mademoiselle left. She was unmusical. She could not draw. On the rare occasions when Jenny lamented her lack of accomplishments, Lydia consolingly reminded her, "You have a faculty for arithmetic. It's not often found in women, the mathematical mind. As an old friend of Uncle George used to tell me when I was a girl, you've inherited the mathematical mind from me." Lydia refused to see that the last words always made Jenny scowl furiously. On Sunday they went to church at Ashlew, and to lunch at Quintmere afterwards, after a fashion that had grown to seem almost immemorial. Lydia never discussed Jenny with Joyce Damerel, whose trenchant judgments, always abruptly and unhesitatingly spoken, seldom coincided with her own. But she had decided to mention the affair of Mr. Roland Valentine to old Lady Lucy, whom she suspected of appraising the young airman at much the same valuation as she did herself. Lydia had no definite intention of breaking her old rule, and of talking about herself, but her mother-in-law would hardly fail to notice the unwonted expression of fatigue that worry had given her face. The day was an unusually hot one, and the slight fatigue engendered by the walk across the field, and by a lengthy and rather tedious sermon, had not detracted, Lydia felt, from her already strained appearance. Outside the church, Lady Lucy made her usual pause at the twin adjacent stones consecrated to the memory of William and of Clement Damerel, and the older monument to their father. Joyce never stood beside her there, but Lydia joined her mother-in-law for a few moments. Lady Lucy spent a briefer time than usual at the graves. She turned, unfurling her shabby black silk parasol, and Lydia moved away beside her. "Oh, my dear," said Lady Lucy in distressed accents, and Lydia turned her encircled eyes full upon her. "Have you heard what they seem to be saying in London? Billy is full of it. There is to be war between Germany and France, and they say that England can't honorably keep out of it." Lydia was confounded. All through luncheon Lady Lucy would talk of nothing else. Joyce Damerel was sturdily optimistic, and said that there would be no war. The Germans were too civilized. Billy predicted war in a week, a war that would be ended by the British Navy in 3 months. "And the aeroplanes," cried Jenny. "Oh, Billy, it'll be a chance for the aeroplanes at last." "Of course," said Billy loftily. He was very much excited and was going up to London that night. They talked about the chances for and against a European war all afternoon, and Lady Lucy sent Jenny to find maps, and then pored over them tremulously, appealing very often to her grandson. Billy, the only man present, was uplifted and instructive, and Lydia was rather surprised at the deference which his mother and grandmother accorded to what they apparently considered to be his superior knowledge. She said to Joyce quietly, "Why, Billy can't even remember the Boer War. You and I can, of course, but these children who are so excited, they don't know what war means. We do." Joyce looked at her strangely. Don't you understand, Lydia, that if there's a war, it won't be ours. It'll be the children's. Our generation won't count at all. It's Billy and Jenny that'll count now, the boys of Billy's age. England won't go to war, said Lydia sharply. She intensely disliked to hear the anguished note that had suddenly come into Joyce Demerel's voice as she looked at her only son. If England went to war, Joyce would see Billy go away to fight. Lydia had only a girl, and there would be no supreme sacrifice for her to make. Joyce had said that only the children would count now, but Lydia thought that the mothers and wives who gave of their nearest would be held to count too. Those who could not go themselves, and who had no one to send, would be the ones that would not count. The thought roused in Lydia a deep and impassioned resentment that she did not attempt to analyze. She put the thought of war from her as far as possible, but Jenny would talk of nothing else, betraying a childish eagerness and excitement that almost made it seem as though she would be disappointed if nothing happened after all. "Couldn't I go as a Red Cross nurse?" she asked babyishly, and Lydia patiently explained that entire lack of training would make such a thing impossible. In her heart, she thought that even if Jenny did attend the Red Cross lectures that Natalie Kennedy was organizing, she was much too young for her services to be accepted in any serious emergency. But she engaged that both Jenny and herself should attend the class. On Tuesday, Mr. Roland Valentine came. "No one will think of anything but this war now," Lydia warned her daughter, not without a certain inward satisfaction in making the prediction. "Very likely Mr. Valentine won't turn up. One can be surprised at nothing, and a young man of that sort might be very useful with his aeroplane." "Of course," said Jenny, and her voice held no clue as to whether she were acquiescing in the former or the latter half of her mother's dictum. Soon after 12 o'clock, however, Lydia made the unwelcome discovery that Jenny was gone out. Gone out, without any hint as to her intentions, and, as Lydia felt no doubt whatever, for the express purpose of meeting Mr. Valentine on his way to the house. Nothing was to be done, except to wait luncheon time, and to hope, in the interests of maidenly discipline, that Jenny would presently return crestfallen without the Canadian. Just before 1 o'clock, however, they came in together. At first, Lydia's discouraging prediction to her daughter seemed about to be fulfilled. They talked only about the war. Mr. Valentine was decided in his expressions. He believed in a short but terrible war, perhaps 3 months, perhaps longer. The war would be fought in the air, not on land and not on sea, although there might be an immense naval battle in which the German fleet, seeking to invade England, would certainly be crushed. But everything would really be settled in the air. He was on his way to London to offer his aeroplane and his own services to the War Office authorities. He had already held a pilot's certificate. They would certainly send him to the front with other aeroplanes and other airmen, as soon as an expeditionary force was organized. That, said Mr. Valentine, might take a week, might take a fortnight, impossible to tell. Every hour must count, and no doubt the authorities would act as rapidly as possible. "Then you think war is certain?" "Absolutely certain," Roland Valentine declared. "Oh," said Jenny suddenly, "we can't stay down here where we hear nothing and know nothing. Mama, we must go to London." "Can you speak French?" Mr. Valentine abruptly asked Jenny. Yes. They'll want women in Belgium. Nurses, you know." "I'd go," Jenny said with shining eyes. "She has no training and is too young. I don't suppose they would accept her," said Lydia calmly. "Dr. West said I was a born nurse," Jenny cried. "Only the other day he said that. A born nurse." And Mr. Roland Valentine, who could know nothing whatever about it, looked across the table and said with emphasis and conviction, "I'll bet you are." "Will you have some cherry tart, Mr. Valentine?" said Lydia prosaically. "And some of our Devonshire dish, junket?" She herself had never taken kindly to the Devonshire junkets, and disliking stewed fruit, sat with an empty plate before her. "I'm not going to be alone, surely," said the Canadian bluntly. "Oh, no. This is Jenny's favorite pudding. That's why I ordered it," said Lydia, smiling. "I wish you wouldn't," burst childishly from Jenny. "It's horrid to see you eating nothing while I'm stuffing. Why didn't you order something we both like?" "My dear child." Lydia's tone conveyed a half-humorous rebuke for Jenny's exaggerated vehemence. "Well," said the child pettishly, "I can't bear people to sacrifice themselves for me. It makes one feel beastly, doesn't it, Mr. Valentine?" she applied to him boldly. "Why, yes, that is so," agreed the youth heartily. "When my young sister first went out to dances I used to take her, my mother being a bit of an invalid, but the dear old lady would insist on sitting up for us, and heating milk on a spirit lamp for Dorothy, and truck of that sort." "Oh!" cried Jenny, glancing at her mother. Roland Valentine glanced at her too, with impudent laughter in his eyes, and yet a hint of apology in his voice. "Of course you know it was kind of rotten for Dorothy. It simply spoilt all her fun for the whole evening." "But why?" Lydia said. "I should have thought she would have been grateful, I must say." "But gratitude is such a beastly feeling," cried young Valentine in candid dismay. Jenny burst out laughing, half nervously. "Oh, Mama, isn't that what I'm always saying? One would so much rather be a little bit uncomfortable, or tired, or hungry, even a lot uncomfortable, than feel that somebody else was just sitting there all the time sacrificing themselves for one." Lydia remained silent, almost surprised at the acuteness with which their youthful crudities could vex her. "I must say," Jenny added to Valentine, as though she disliked the silence following on her outburst, "I do thoroughly sympathize with your sister. Did your mother always go on sitting up for her?" "Oh, by Jove, no," said Valentine cheerfully. "My mother's a dear, really, and we made her understand that really and truly that sort of thing is only a form of self-indulgence. Just keeping herself out of bed for nothing in the world except to make poor Dorothy feel herself the worst kind of selfish pig whenever she went out to a party and came in late. The old lady quite saw it after a bit, and just left the spirit lamp and the milk and things in the hall and toddled off to bed herself at 10 o'clock or so." Every word that the bold, self-assured young voice was uttering jarred upon Lydia, and his phraseology, no less than his sentiments, struck her as being in the worst possible taste. And oh, how bad for Jenny to hear. That was what really perturbed Lydia the most. The spirit that Roland Valentine had epitomized in slangy, spontaneous speech, "Gratitude is such a beastly feeling," must have been latent since babyhood in the modern, essentially unsubtle Jenny. But Lydia knew very well that the very circumstances of her upbringing had precluded the possibility of her child's ever formulating definitely such dicta as those so unsparingly delivered by the young man who sat there calmly eating Lydia's cherry pie and cream and junket. She decided that they better not be left alone together after lunch. "What time would you like me to order the pony cart, Mr. Valentine? We can easily drive you to the station. I think my daughter told me that you wanted to catch the 3:30 from Ashlew? Thanks very much. I wish I could have stayed around a bit longer. There's quite a good train at 6, but everything is so dislocated one daren't risk it, and I must get to London before tonight. Look here, I'll send you a wire to say how things are up there." "Oh, yes, do." "Oh, thank you," said Jenny ardently. Evidently gratitude was no longer an intolerable sensation when applied to a contemporary, reflected Lydia, not without humor. A rather strained quarter of an hour ensued in the shade of the small, pleasant garden. Conversation reverted to the war. "Has anything been heard of your young cousin, Billy Damerel?" "His mother may have had a letter this morning." "I shall see him tonight, I expect. Only son, isn't he?" "Yes," said Lydia briefly. "Of course he'll join the army at once," said Jenny excitedly. Would they send them out to Belgium immediately, do you suppose? Just as quick as they can get them across, I should imagine. Silence fell again, and Lydia felt both constraint and a certain hostility vibrating in the atmosphere. She had not any doubt now that Jenny and Jenny's barefaced admirer resented her presence. But what in heaven's name could he want to say to the child? They had only met twice. Lydia did not waste wonder over Jenny's only too evident predilection for common, good-looking Mr. Valentine. He was that romantic and mysterious being, a flying man. He might be sent to his death within the next week. He gazed at Jenny with boldly admiring blue eyes, and he was young. That, in Lydia's opinion, was enough for any girl. She could remember that in her own girlhood the few attractions that she had felt had primarily been based upon grounds no more solid. Even her first inclination towards Clement Damerel had been merely an instinctive conviction that here was breeding superior to anything that she had as yet known, and a candid admiration for his good looks. In common with many women of her nationality, her class, and her passionless temperament, Lydia honestly believed that love should come after marriage if it were to be enduring. Quite lately, vague suspicions of other and more volcanic forces latent in Jenny had begun to render her uneasy. "Please, ma'am, Miss Quinch is here and says you wanted to speak to her, ma'am." "Oh." Lydia was momentarily startled. She had quite forgotten her summons to the little village dressmaker. "I must see her a minute. I'll come, Susan." Roland Valentine and Jenny had both risen almost before Lydia had stirred from her chair. Jenny was looking down at the ground, but Valentine's face showed an almost blatant triumph, and there was no longer constraint in the air. "I shan't be a moment," Lydia repeated, and was unable to resist adding, "It's about your new frock, Jenny. You said you wanted Miss Quinch to make it, and I've got the stuff you like. Do you want to see it?" "No, thank you, Mama. I saw the pattern. I'd rather you arrange it all with Miss Quinch." Lydia's smile was finely ironical as she turned into the house. Miss Quinch was slow and also talkative, and it took time to dispose of her. When Lydia came back to the lawn at last, she was vexed, but scarcely surprised, to find the encampment of deck chairs deserted. Exactly what she should have expected, not only from young Valentine's offhand lack of manners, but from Jenny's schoolgirl love of an escapade. Lydia looked at her watch. In less than half an hour's time, the pony cart, in reality a hired jingle from the village that always served them when required, would arrive in order to convey Mr. Valentine to the station. Not very much could be said or done inside half an hour by two young people who knew one another so slightly, surely, Lydia endeavored to assure herself without much conviction. However, it would be altogether too undignified to go in search of them, and might encourage Jenny's foolish and youthful tendency to look upon her mother, in reality her best friend, as an unreasonable tyrant to be outwitted whenever possible. Heaven knew, Lydia reflected sadly, she had sympathy enough and to spare for Jenny's youth. Had she not striven to shelter and protect and save Jenny as she herself during her girlhood had never been sheltered and protected and saved? Nor would she refuse to let the child try her own wings some day, though Lydia was conscious that therein lay the effort, as the thought brought its accustomed pang. But when Jenny should love and marry, her choice must fall upon such a man as her father had been, such a man as the Damerels had mated with from time immemorial. Lydia's inward insistence on the point dated from Jenny's birth, and before, and was stronger in its intensity from her own never-spoken but never-forgotten realization of the strange and intangible gulf that had been crossed when Clement Damerel had married Lydia Raymond. It was a pity that Jenny and Billy Damerel were first cousins. A clock struck in the little drawing-room, the chimes audible through the open window, and Lydia looked again at her watch. In 10 minutes the jingle would come. Was there, or was there not, a faint occasional murmur of voices somewhere within the house? It might be Susan and Miss Quinch in the tiny sewing room that was only an offshoot from the kitchen. Or it might be another conversation proceeding from the old schoolroom upstairs. But what in the world could they be doing there? Lydia would not look up at the window, knowing, moreover, that a curtain of ivy and climbing roses would probably make it impossible for her to see inside the room even if she did so. But in another few minutes she went into the house and upstairs to her own room to put on her hat and gloves preparatory for driving. If Jenny should resent the enforced chaperonage, as she certainly would, Lydia sincerely regretted it, but there must be no more tete-a-tetes with a third-rate young man from Canada. Lydia suspected that there had been too many such already. From her room she heard the Jingles' arrival at the front door. "Jenny!" Lydia stood on the stairs, her shady mushroom hat already on her head, drawing on a pair of brown gauntlet gloves. "Jenny!" she called in a reasonable and moderate summons. Susan appeared in the hall below. "The pony is at the door, ma'am." "Thank you, Susan. Do you know where Miss Jenny is?" The door of the old schoolroom, one flight of stairs higher than that upon which Lydia stood, was wrenched open with an effect of violence. "I'm here, mamma," said Jenny. "Is it time to go?" "Quite time, if you don't take more than a minute to put on your hat. Is Mr. Valentine there?" Jenny turned round to the schoolroom again. In the shaded gloom of the narrow staircase Lydia had been unable, peering upwards, to see her face distinctly. She wondered if she should go up herself. "I do hope I haven't kept you waiting," said the voice of Mr. Roland Valentine, suave and yet indescribably casual. "I'm awfully sorry." He came downstairs 2 steps at a time. "You mustn't miss your train," said Lydia coldly. She walked downstairs, followed by the young man. "Be quick, Jenny." Jenny hung over the banisters. "I don't think I'm coming, mamma." Her voice sounded rather uncertain, and Lydia was for a moment entirely nonplussed. Was it a childish display of pique provoked by Lydia's intention of accompanying the expedition? Or had Mr. Valentine made some ill-bred demonstrations of admiration that had offended and perhaps frightened Jenny? Lydia felt a certain relief as the idea crossed her mind. In any event, the point could not be debated now. "My daughter has a good many little jobs in the garden and the village that take up her time," she said in smiling but purposely formal apology for Jenny's capriciousness. "It's very good of you to drive me yourself, Mrs. Damerel," said Valentine, and they got into the jingle, and Lydia took up the reins. End of Chapter 24. Recording by C.J. Plogue. Chapter 25 of The Heel of Achilles by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lydia was not destined ever to forget that expedition to Ashlew Station in the jingle, nor the sense of shock with which she heard Mr. Roland Valentine's first-level pronouncement, delivered before they were out of the short, steep approach that led into the lane outside. "I suppose you've realized, Mrs. Damerel, that I was clean bowled over at very first sight." So much astonished was Lydia at the rapidity with which had come a crisis that she had as yet barely foreshadowed, even to herself, that she could only gaze at the young man beside her in silent dismay. He seemed heated, but not at all discomposed. "Do you mean Jenny?" said Lydia at last. "I do. From the very first minute I saw her," repeated Mr. Valentine emphatically, "I knew that there was the only girl I should ever marry. The only question was whether she would see it too." "That is very far from being the only question," Lydia began severely, but the young man went on unheeding. "However, it's all right, thank God. You may say that with the country on the eve of the most appalling war that this world has ever seen, it's no moment to think of such things. But on the other hand, it's every man's instinct to get what he can while he can, and the opportunities of the younger generation will be curtailed a bit from now on, I fancy. It's just a case of cramming into a few weeks or days, maybe, what you older folks have had all your lifetime to enjoy." "Lydia,"
Beyond a sense of indignation at the youth's assumption of his ability to enlighten her knowledge as though she were already outside the full current of life, had hardly heard his earnestly spoken speech. She was aware of only one preoccupation. "You haven't said anything to my daughter yet, surely?" "Why, yes, Mrs. de Merrill. That's the very thing I came down to do, though I don't say I should have had the nerve if it hadn't been for this war news. But it's every man's duty now, in my opinion, to fix himself up, and the duty of every healthy young woman to help carry on the race." "I didn't put it that way to your daughter," Mr. Valentine admitted, "but I guess there wasn't any need for arguments. She and I understand one another, Mrs. de Merrill." "After meeting 3 times, or is it twice?" said Lydia ironically. "I assure you, Mr. Valentine, that things are not done like that in this country, whatever they may be in Canada. I don't at all understand your having spoken to Jenny, who is a very young and inexperienced girl, without first obtaining my leave to do so. But in any case, you must see that I can't discuss the matter with you until I've spoken to her." "She thought you might say something like that," observed Valentine thoughtfully. "What do you mean? Why didn't she speak to me herself, if she had anything to tell me?" Mr. Valentine looked straight in front of him. "You see, you've made Jenny a good deal afraid of you, Mrs. de Merrill." The pang of grief and mortification and anger that shook Lydia from head to foot kept her silent from its very intensity. Her shaking hands gripped one another. "I saw that, of course, the very first evening I met you together at Quintmere," went on the calmly judicial young voice, "and I've had some talk with Jenny since, you know." "I can't discuss with you either Jenny or my relations with Jenny, Mr. Valentine. You seem to forget that you are practically a stranger to us both." The young man turned and looked at her with something that was almost compassion. "I suppose it must seem that way to you. But I'd like you to realize," he said gently, "that Jenny and I really do mean to get married. Now don't say anything for a minute or two. Just let me put a few facts before you. I know I must seem almost like an adventurer to you folks down here, tearing about the country on a crazy flying machine and talking with what you probably take for an accent. But that isn't so. You ask young Billy Damerel, who brought me down here anyway. He'll put you on to the track of quite a lot of Oxford people who can tell you about me. And I've a respectable old aunt up there, too, a sister of my dead father's. She's all right, born in England, married an Englishman, never left England in her life. Now I'm quite sure that you'll want to ask a lot of questions about me, and I'm willing to answer you, or anyone you may appoint to ask them for you. But time is short, Mrs. Damerel, and may get much shorter. I don't know what they'll do with me up there." He jerked his thumb in a direction that vaguely indicated London and the War Office. "But I don't suppose anyway it'll be so very long before I'm over at the front. If England won't send me, then France will. And I want to get this business fixed up right away if it can be done." "But it can't be done, Mr. Valentine." Lydia rallied the courage that, after all, she had never lacked in all her life. "Even if I, who am Jenny's sole guardian, were to consent to a provisional engagement between you, which would depend entirely on the result of those inquiries which, as you rightly say, must be made, even then I should be doing quite wrong in allowing my child to marry yet. You must remember that I know Jenny through and through. She is quite undeveloped in every way, and even supposing that her first love affair has taken her fancy, that would be no reason for letting her rush into matrimony before she's ready for it." "Marriage is nature," said Mr. Valentine bluntly. "Why shouldn't a healthy girl of 18 be ready for it when she cares for the man who offers it to her? I shouldn't take Jenny to poverty, Mrs. Damerel. Of course, I quite understand that any assertion I make must be verified, and you'll find that's easily done. But I may tell you, right here and now, that I have a small private income, about $400 a year, left to me by the old man. My mother is not dependent on me, and my sister, there are only 2 of us, is married and provided for." And besides that, I have the offer of a job as chief assistant engineer in the experimental department of Messrs. Gledhill and Swan, the big engineering firm in Toronto. This war may scotch that for the time being, but I don't think I should have any difficulty in finding something else of the same sort after the war. And if Jenny didn't like the idea of Canada, I'd be willing to stick to England. But I think personally she'd love the life out there and just do fine in it. But I thought you wanted to go to Belgium with your aeroplane, Lydia said quickly, as though convicting the young man of idle boasting. Why, yes, that's quite right. So I do. And so I mean to. So you see, if Jenny marries me and then I get a German bullet through me, she'll be left provided for under my will, and probably receive a pension as well as my widow. Thus cheerfully did Mr. Valentine dispose of Lydia's challenge. They drew up before the small station, and Lydia fastened the pony's head to the painted white rails after the country fashion. I hope the train hasn't gone. But the train was not even signaled. She'll be 40 minutes late, said the porter with gloomy importance. 'Tis the same all along the line, Miss Damerel. Do 'ee sit down in the shade and have patience now. 'Tis the war, as they say we'm coming to. Lydia and Mr. Valentine looked at one another. That philosopher is just about right, I guess, said the young man. If you needn't hurry back, we can sit here and finish our talk. Lydia assented. She felt that in the first moment of shock she had probably failed to express herself with sufficient decision. Mr. Roland Valentine should return to London under no misapprehension. There really is very little more to be said, Mr. Valentine. Apart from everything else, this is not a time for insisting upon one's small personal affairs. If England really is going into this war, no one knows what may happen. Values will be all turned upside down, and nothing will ever be the same again. Why, the country might even be invaded, as poor Belgium has been. It doesn't bear thinking of. You can see for yourself that this is no time to take risks. Now, why do you say that? I'm quite sure that you took risks in your time. Why do you grudge Jenny the experience of taking hers? The question made Lydia very angry. Do you realize that you are adopting a most offensive attitude in speaking as though I was Jenny's enemy? As though I were anything but the best friend she has in the world. You said just now that I'd made her afraid of me. If Jenny has said or implied that to you, then it shows most heartless ingratitude. But I can't believe it. Bitter though it is to me to own it, she and I have not always lived in peace together. But Jenny has never heard a harsh or unkind word from me since she was born. Lydia could hardly go on speaking for a moment. Her passionate self-justification, made almost as much to herself as to Roland Valentine, was vibrant with intense sincerity. It seemed to her that she was at last putting into words her own inner knowledge. The knowledge that loyalty to her disloyal child and the old habit of reticence had never before allowed her to formulate. Jenny was 9 years old when her father died. I was a young woman, but I lived quietly in the country for the child's sake. I devoted myself to her. You understand that I'm not saying this as though I were boasting of it, but your attitude forces me to put the facts before you in so many words. I watched over her health. I worked for her, mended for her, did everything for her, and now I'm told by a stranger who hasn't known my child a fortnight that I've made her afraid of me? Well, that is so. Mr. Valentine's tone was impersonal, although he poked with his stick at the soft red gravel beneath the bench on which they sat, as though he wished to look at that, and not at Lydia. Jenny is very young, and perhaps undeveloped, as you say, Mrs. Damerel, but you don't need me to tell you that she has a very strong individuality, and that's just what the trouble is. She's afraid all the time, whether she knows it or not, of your swamping that. Jenny very much resents your working for her, and mending for her, and doing everything for her, the way you say you always have. I guess she feels it's just about time she shouldered some responsibility for herself. But she's not fitted for it, You don't understand. Jenny can't do the simplest practical thing for herself. She couldn't undertake any real responsibility yet." "Why, she knows that right enough. And you see, it makes her feel that the sooner she buys her experience and learns, the better. It's just your care and your protection that she's afraid of, Mrs. Damerel. And because she's just a child, and undisciplined, her instincts for asserting her own individuality take an ungracious form, that's all. She hasn't analyzed her own feelings the way I'm analyzing them now, because she isn't the introspective kind. She just feels she's up against it and doesn't quite know why." "No, she doesn't," said Lydia bitterly, "and I may add that in my opinion neither do you. Do you quite realize, I wonder, Mr. Valentine, the absurdity of this, that you, a very young man and practically a stranger to both of us, should be endeavoring to explain to me my own child, whom I've been studying ever since she was born?" "As to that," said Mr. Valentine, still without heat, "your studying hasn't led to any very great success, if I may point that out. It looks as though the result had only been to make you and Jenny fret one another considerably, and make Jenny think herself a wicked, ungrateful girl, when she's only a perfectly natural one put into a false position. Now, in Canada, a girl like Jenny would have been independent if she'd wanted to be some time ago. She'd have gone to school, for one thing, and she'd have been helping in the household work for another, and taking her due share of responsibility all the time. That's the privilege as well as the duty, after all, of every human being, isn't it? And she might have taken up school teaching, or worked as a stenographer or a secretary in some business in the city, and just been home for her vacations. I guess if that had been so over here, she'd have been glad enough to be waited on and made a fuss of when she did come back to you in holiday time. But as things are, it just seems as though you were refusing her the natural right of the individual, the right of experience. And these are the thanks that I get for sacrificing myself for my child," cried Lydia, almost involuntarily letting the words break from the sharpest pain that she had ever known. "Well, it's only another kind of sacrifice that's wanted, that's all," said Mr. Valentine calmly. "If you want to sacrifice yourself some more for Jenny, Mrs. Damerel, it seems to me the way you can do it best is just the way that'll hurt you most. Let her take her own risks and shoulder her own responsibilities. It's the lot of parents, I suppose, to watch the children for whom they would lay down their lives spurn the help and tenderness that sheltered their childhood, and rush ignorantly and foolhardily to try their own wings." "See here," said the young man earnestly, "Jenny isn't going to be alone. Jenny's going to marry me. I don't say much about that side of the question, because I feel I've kind of butted in too much already, and you'd most likely rather not hear any more about me for quite a while, or, at any rate, until you've heard what Jenny has to say. But I'll make her a good husband, Mrs. Damerel, as God Almighty hears me say it now." He bared his head for a moment with a curious, reverent simplicity. "I'm not the romantic sort, and Jenny isn't either. But I kind of knew right away that she and I are just meant for one another, and I've never felt that way before, although in Canada we've a great deal more freedom than boys and girls over here, and get to know one another pretty intimately." Lydia's strained mind turned instinctively to what already seemed to have become a side issue. "Do you mean that you've already asked Jenny to marry you?" "That's what I came down to do. I'd have asked her that evening at Quintmere, that wonderful evening when she came to the field to look at my old machine under its tarpaulin. Only I was kind of afraid it might scare her if I was too quick, somehow," said Valentine with a slightly apologetic laugh. "That old house, and the old lady there, and all the old servants that seem to have grown up there, made me feel like a sort of mushroom sprung up in the night. But Jenny didn't seem part of it altogether, not the way that young Billy does, who'll own it all some day, I suppose. Jenny's outgrown it all, Mrs. Damerel. She's just crying out for the new order of things, and I'm going to see that she gets it." As though to enhance the effect of ultimatum with which the words were spoken, A sudden stir traversed the sleepy little station. The porter came up again to Lydia. "Signaled now, Miss Damerel. She'll be in directly." Lydia and Roland Valentine both rose. She looked at him with challenging eyes. "I shall write to you, Mr. Valentine, when I have heard what Jenny has to say, and don't consider, please, that I can give you any encouragement whatever. The very way in which you have precipitated things shows a want of real respect for my daughter." "I guess the war isn't going to wait for any of us," said Mr. Valentine. "This card has my address. The club will always find me. But it's only fair to tell you that Jenny has it too, and I'm expecting her to make use of it. I'm sorry things have happened this way, Mrs. Damerel, and I wish I had more time to try and put my viewpoint before you. But if I can fix things up in London the way I expect, and get leave to come down and fetch my machine away from Plymouth, you'll be seeing me around again very shortly. Meanwhile, goodbye, and thank you." The train came into the station, and Mr. Valentine, unhampered by luggage, gravely raised his cap to Lydia in salutation and got inside. Neither made any movement towards shaking hands. Lydia turned away with the despairing sense that she did not know what to do next. She felt unable to face Jenny. Jenny, who had given her no confidences, who had told the stranger with whom she thought herself to be in love that she was afraid of her mother. Lydia thought that later on perhaps she might be able to talk to Jenny. For the moment, she wanted only to assuage her own desperate pain. As she turned out of the station, she came face to face with Natalie's husband, Colonel Kennedy. For an instant, her first fear was lest he should notice the misery in her face and ask her what had happened. But the Colonel only said abruptly, "London papers not come. I suppose you came on the same errand, Mrs. Damerel. But what's the use? We shall be kept without news till tomorrow now, I suppose. My boy has promised to telegraph from Greenwich. You know his brother has had to rejoin his ship." "Alec?" "Telegraphed for. We don't even know where he is." "He seems so young," sighed Lydia. "Well, anyhow, your little Charlie is all right. He'll be out of it all at his age." "He's only 13, said the Colonel gruffly. "They'll rush 'em through like anything, though. I'm glad now that they neither of them had a fancy for soldiering and chose the Navy instead. They can be made use of right away, young as they are, if they're wanted." Lydia looked at him with involuntary admiration. "How's Natalie?" "Come along and see her," said Colonel Kennedy. Lydia accepted with a certain relief. She wanted to postpone her return home, hardly able to bear the thought of speaking to Jenny, and reflecting also that delay would give her daughter time for thought. She felt, too, with a sudden and most unwanted sense of dependence, that Natalie was her earliest friend, one of her own time and generation who would assuredly understand and comfort her. For the first time she consciously felt need of that quiet, stable affection and friendship of Natalie's that had always been there, waiting in the background of Lydia's whole existence. She raised her tired eyes. "I'll come with you now," she said to the Colonel. "Poor Natalie, she must be frightfully anxious, and though one can't do anything, it may be a comfort to her to have someone to talk to." Involuntarily she put forward Natalie's possible need of her, not hers of Natalie. "Thank you, yes," said the Colonel. And when he took Lydia into his wife's drawing room, Natalie exclaimed gratefully, "Oh, Lydia, how dear and good of you to come! I knew I should see you soon." Natalie showed Lydia the telegram that had recalled their elder boy, the sailor, and speculated vainly as to when they might hope to know where he was, and she recapitulated with a mixture of wistfulness and pride the chances that little Charlie, too, would be sent to sea before the war was over. Her husband, she said, would try to rejoin his old regiment. "Because of course it's war, Lydia. Jack says the Germans have been working for this all along, that they're mad enough to want to fight us. Oh, doesn't it all seem like a nightmare? And a week ago we were all so peaceful and happy." "What is Billy Damerel going to do, Lydia?" "He's in London. He told Joyce that he should enlist the minute the war is declared. Of course they'll give him a commission. Of course, his poor mother. Lydia let Natalie go on talking and listened almost as though she were in a dream. It seemed to her extraordinary that now, when she was suffering as she had never in her life suffered before, this supreme preoccupation should have come over the whole world, absorbing all attention, all speculation. It even struck her as remarkable that she should presently be having tea with Natalie in the small porch overlooking the garden, and that Natalie should still have made no reference to the topic that absorbed her own thoughts. But of course, Natalie knew nothing about it. If she were to know, Lydia must tell her. It had never been Lydia's way to make confidences about her own affairs. Grandpapa's lesson had been too well learned for that, and she had preferred other people to guess or infer it when trouble overtook her. She had often noticed, even whilst showing herself sympathetic and interested, how very ready others were to talk about themselves and make their confidences, in curious contrast to herself. But Natalie evidently had guessed nothing. She talked on and on about the war, about her own 2 boys and the sons of the neighboring families in the county. 1 or 2 young soldiers she knew had already received peremptory orders to rejoin their regiments. That young Scotsman the bishop's daughter is engaged to has had to go, Lydia. They may even have to put off the wedding. I do think it's hard on the girl. If I were her, I should get married as quickly as possible, I think. Why? Said Lydia sharply. They'll have had something anyhow that way. If they were married, she could be with him up to the last minute, and perhaps go and look after him if he's wounded later on. I've heard lots of people say that. Oh, Lydia, it's going to be dreadful for all these young people. Look at your own Jenny. She's not begun life yet, and there she is in the midst of tragedy and horror. All the boys of her own age going off to fight and be killed, perhaps. She's had none of the innocent enjoyment that we had yet, and heaven knows if they'll any of them enjoy anything any more now. This nightmare won't last. It can't last, said Lydia. They're young. They'll recover from all this and have their lives before them. It's we, who know what it all means, that are the worst sufferers, I think. Look at you, Natalie, having to let Alec go, and perhaps little Charlie. Natalie shook her head. Her eyes were full of tears, and she did not speak. Presently her father came and joined them. Mr. Palmer was a very old man, but he didn't seem to Lydia to have changed a great deal since the early days of her own married life, when he had lived his gentle, unobtrusive life beside her and Clement at the rectory, and treated her now as though she were his daughter. It was he who gazed at her with his mild, good blue eyes that needed no glasses yet, even though they had lost their brightness, and said gently, "You've come to share this anxiety with us, Lydia, my dear. That's very good of you. But you look tired and troubled. There is no fresh news, is there?" "Nothing that I know of." Lydia, overwrought and resentful of Natalie's blindness, could not withstand the kind anxiety with which Mr. Palmer still looked at her. "I am worried, though I hardly know if I ought to say anything about it to anyone yet. But I'm afraid little Jenny has been reckless and silly. I've not been taking proper care of her." "Oh, Lydia, Jenny's not ill, is she, poor child?" said Natalie, her voice all genuine concern at once. "No, no. She's embarked on I don't know what to call it, except a sort of flirtation with that Canadian friend of Billy's, the young man who came down here in a flying machine the other day." "I remember," said Natalie. "Isn't he nice, Lydia?" "Rather third rate, and besides they don't know each other. They just met that once at Quintmere, when I'm sorry to say that I let Jenny stay there without me just for one night, and then they seem to have arranged that he should call on us here on his way from Plymouth." "I remember you told me," said Natalie. "Did he come?" "He came today." Lydia paused, and her mouth tightened. She could never bring herself to speak to anyone of the things, the unpardonable things, that young Valentine had said to her. She did not wish to recall them to her own mind when they stabbed her afresh with every involuntary recollection. "Well," said Natalie placidly, "you'll have heaps of things of that sort to reckon with, Lydia, now that Jenny's grown up. I've always thought the girls must be more trouble than boys, especially if they're attractive. Jenny will marry young, I'm sure." "She won't marry this young man," said Lydia. Natalie said something about Canada being a long way off, and then her face changed again. "But poor little girls of this generation, there may not be anyone for them to marry. Who knows what is going to happen?" The rector's eyes had never left Lydia's face. "Is this young Canadian undesirable in any way, my dear?" "His manners are not good," Lydia declared. "Really, I know very little about him." Her tone was quite purposely light, as though by treating the subject casually, she were relegating Mr. Roland Valentine and his proposal to the negligible value of a mere episode. "And little Jenny is in love with him?" "He is conceited enough to think so," said Lydia. She even laughed with a curious sense of relief at being able thus trivially to present the Canadian's declared certainty that his love was returned. It was as though, while convincing the rector and Natalie, she was also convincing herself. "Jenny and I haven't had our talk about it yet. He stole a march on her when I drove him to the station this afternoon." "I should let them be engaged if I were you, Lydia," Natalie said wearily. "If we're all going to war, heaven knows what will happen to any of us, and she'll, anyway, have a man to take care of her. I suppose he'll go back to Canada?" "I suppose so. I don't know," said Lydia stiffly. She did not want to proclaim the Canadian's intention of taking his aeroplane into the zone of war, aware that the knowledge would only strengthen Natalie in her unconsidered advice to let the young generation snatch at its desires of the moment. "I must go, Natalie. The child will be wondering what has happened to me. If you get any news, you'll let me know?" "At once. Oh, Lydia, what shall we see in the papers tomorrow?" Lydia went away with the speculation still ringing in her ears. She felt unreasonably resentful that Natalie had taken no serious interest in the individual problems centering around Jenny and the decision of her future that lay in Jenny's mother's hands. But she realized that the resentment was unjust, and that she herself had purposely spoken as though the affair were of no account. How could she do otherwise, when the real hurt lay in those phrases that Lydia so passionately denied and repudiated, in which young Valentine had arrogantly taken upon himself to epitomize her mental and moral attitude towards her child. End of Chapter 25. Recording by C.J. Plogue. Chapter 26 of The Heel of Achilles by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The country had been at war for over a month, and the epidemic of war marriages had already set in. Engaged girls bought special licenses, bought their own wedding rings, held everything in readiness for an immediate marriage whenever he should get leave. And every day fresh engagements were announced. "What are they all thinking about?" said Lydia half impatiently when they heard at Ashlew that the bishop had taken his daughter to London himself at 24 hours' notice to marry her Highlander. She said it only because it seemed to her that everything was conspiring to the ultimate achievement of an immediate marriage between Jenny and Roland Valentine. It would come to that. Lydia knew it quite well, had known it with absolute certainty ever since old Lady Lucy, the conservative, the tradition-bound Lady Lucy, had said to her very gently, "I'm very sorry for you, my dear, but poor little Jenny. Let her be happy while she can. We hear nothing against this young man, quite the contrary, and this is a new world we're going to live in. The old traditions mustn't be made binding on these young folks who are giving up everything." "And I think he is a good young man," said Lady Lucy emphatically. Valentine was at Ashlew again, with 3 days' leave before departing with his aeroplane to the front. "He's not a gentleman," said Lydia, her mouth hardening. She remembered how once upon a time Lady Lucy had begged her son Clement to wait, before asking in marriage a girl who was indubitably not of his own social standing. "Colonial manners are never the same as ours," declared Lady Lucy. "My dear, I think that in all the essentials Mr. Valentine is a gentleman, and somehow the little rule of thumb by which one always had measured things up to now doesn't seem to hold good any longer. We must go back to essentials in these terrible times, the old primitive things. Supposing I let Jenny marry him, and he is killed in a week, what has she gained? Supposing you don't let her marry him, and he is killed, what then?" asked the old lady gently. "Would Jenny ever forgive you, Lydia?" At Jenny's age, though it would be a brutal thing to say to her now, one's first love is not one's last. She would almost certainly come to care for someone else. Lydia's mother-in-law did not point out to her that the argument applied as much to Jenny prematurely widowed as to Jenny unwedded. Instead, she put into words an insistent intuition of Lydia's own that she had tried strenuously to stifle. "My dear, forgive me, but have you altogether taken into consideration Jenny's temperament? She might, as you say, come to care for someone else, but will it ever be like this again?" Lady Lucy's old face flushed delicately. "It was love at first sight on both sides, Lydia, and they are madly in love. The change in little Jenny is one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen." Lydia winced. To her lifelong instinct of repression, that ardor of Jenny's, unrestrained as unconcealed, came as something almost shocking. It was true that Jenny was changed. Lydia had seen traces of tempestuous tears on her face on the very evening of the day that Roland Valentine had gone up to London, driven to the station by Lydia. And Jenny had said, "I'm crying because I'm so madly happy. I didn't know anybody on earth could be so happy. I can't help crying." She cried, but her eyes said, as her lips had said, that it was because she was so madly happy. When the war was declared and Lydia, white-faced, had bidden Jenny try to realize what it might mean for all of them, for England, for Billy Damerel, for Natalie's boys, for thousands of other boys, Jenny had said recklessly, "I know it's all true, and that I don't realize it. I can't even realize Roland is going out there, and whatever happens, nothing can ever take away what I've had." What Jenny had had. In those early days she had had less than half a dozen meetings with Roland Valentine, one impassioned declaration of love, a brief, imperative farewell, and then only long daily letters, of which Lydia knew nothing but that they sent Jenny, radiant-eyed, to the inditing of blotted, scrawled replies, to be sealed and taken to the post office in her own clasp. Now 6 weeks later, by degrees that seemed to Lydia in the retrospect sometimes almost imperceptible, and sometimes tempestuously sudden, Jenny had, as she put it, a good deal more. Roland Valentine's claim as to his modest income, and the considerable salary that he would be in a position to obtain when he chose to apply for it, were triumphantly verified. Other inquiries, of which Jenny, so far as Lydia was aware, had been told little, but which were stringently made through Billy Damerel and Colonel Kennedy, met with unimpeachable reassurances. And so the young man came down to Ashlew once more, wearing the magic uniform that still excited a display of enthusiasm all over England whenever it appeared. Lady Lucy capitulated. The Kennedys, Natalie eagerly and her husband more cautiously, advocated the cause of the lovers. Joyce Damerel had always unwaveringly, if hitherto almost silently, supported Jenny's claims against her mother. "Of course they're engaged," said Joyce. "He's asked her to be his wife, and she's promised. The only question is whether you'll let them marry at once, Lydia. And I don't see how you can refuse in times like these." Lydia was making her last stand. She knew herself defeated. She knew that Jenny and Roland Valentine would marry in the course of his first leave from the front. She even knew clearly and inexorably that her position to the marriage was based upon no objection that could be made valid in the eyes of the Damerels, the Kennedys, her other friends. She argued with them, not because she thought for a moment that argument would convince them, but in a desperate last effort to cheat herself into believing that her attitude was what she represented it to be, and not the mere manifestation of an impassioned resentment that the man to take Jenny from her should be a man who saw her, and would encourage Jenny to see her, with the hard, defiant gaze of youth in judgment. She never liked Joyce Damerel, but in the new and overwhelming sense of loneliness that had come upon her, Lydia appealed to Joyce. "Can't you understand? When all the objection as to Canada, and his not being altogether quite, and Jenny's youth, and all the rest of it, when they've all been disposed of, there's still something else, Joyce. Roland Valentine doesn't like me. How can you expect him to? He knows that you're against the marriage. It was before that. A sort of antagonism. Don't you remember that very first evening of all, when we all dined at Quintmere?" "I remember that he took Jenny's part every time," said Joyce bluntly. "Surely you wouldn't want him to do anything else, Lydia? If he loves her and is going to marry her, how can you possibly want him to take anybody's part but hers? Ever? Why must there be parts to take?" Joyce shrugged her shoulders. "Now you're raising another issue altogether." "Yes, that's quite true," said Lydia, collecting herself. "My point is this, though. An older man, one of more experience and wider sympathies, would have understood my position, my whole attitude in regard to Jenny, and would have brought her in time to see it too. This boy, with his crude, colonial ideas of independence, and his young, arrogant, heartless verdict, 'Gratitude is a beastly feeling,' he actually said that to me, Joyce, quite naively. Everything that is defiant and ungrateful in Jenny he will exaggerate." "I don't think Jenny is ungrateful to you, exactly." "Do you think I want gratitude from my own child?" cried Lydia illogically. "Yes," said Joyce, "you do. You want unquestioning gratitude from her the whole time, and unquestioning acceptance of everything that you do for her. And it's absolutely against nature that you should get it, Lydia. Jenny is sturdy and independent by nature. If she hadn't been, by this time you would have made her into a helpless, selfish, boneless weakling. As it is, of course, she's in a state of constant rebellion. She wants to be generous and to give, and to take care in her turn, and so she ought. But you want to arrogate all those rights to yourself." "What you are accusing me of," said Lydia bitterly, "is of having loved Jenny too well and sacrificed myself too much for her sake." "I?" said Joyce slowly. "If you want to know, Lydia, I think you the most monstrous egotist that I have ever known in my life." Not only the shock of hearing herself so described, but also the amazement of hearing so trenchant a personality from Joyce Damerel, who was never personal and seldom vehement, kept Lydia absolutely silent. She looked at her sister-in-law without a word. Joyce faced her unflinchingly, and without any compassion or hesitation in her gaze. "Perhaps I've no right to say these things to you, but for once I'm going to. While Clement was alive, I shouldn't have said a word. It was for him to say it, if anyone did, only he never would have. Oh, I know he was your husband, but I knew Clement and his brother in their nursery days. We were all more or less brought up together, and he never would have spoken for fear of hurting you. He'd only have kept Jenny more and more with him. Do you remember when Clement died, how you kept on telling me that Jenny was too young to understand, that she wouldn't really feel it? You didn't want her to feel it, because you wanted to have the sole prerogative of grief. Clement's mother is old, and a saint. Even you couldn't grudge her sorrow. But you knew very well that she wouldn't claim any pity or sympathy, and the very old are too near eternity to get the compassion of the multitude. You wanted it all for yourself. You grudged Jenny her share, and you wouldn't admit that she had any right to suffer at all. And it's been like that all along. Jenny may have the nice little happy, easy, trivial things especially if she owes them all to you. And everyone knows it. But the real experiences, the things that hurt and teach one, and are the privilege of the people that are to be worth anything, those she must leave to you. And you try to believe, and make everyone else believe, that because you make Jenny's clothes, and live economically, and are a wonderful manager, and save money for her, and do the tiresome things in the house yourself, so that she can enjoy herself in the garden, because of all that, you love Jenny as no daughter has ever been loved before, and it puzzles and pains everyone that she doesn't seem grateful and loving in return. Well, it isn't Jenny you love at all. It's yourself. I don't believe you ever loved anyone, Lydia. A very far-away echo of the past came dimly to Lydia's stunned perceptions. A little pale-faced Cockney girl, Rosie Graham, the cashier at Elena's, had once said something to her like that. "I know very little about your life before you married Clement," said Joyce ruthlessly. "Perhaps there was someone then. But you didn't want any friends or relations to come and stay with you as most girls do when they marry and have a house. Natalie told us you had cousins, and an aunt and uncle who brought you up, and friends in London, but we never saw any of them. Your aunt came when we were all away, and after you'd been married for years and years. Clement wanted her to come while he was alive, and it was you who didn't want anyone." "It was our home. Why should I want other people?" Lydia attempted to justify herself mechanically and without conviction. Joyce laughed contemptuously. "That cock won't fight, my dear. The old rector came to you at your own suggestion before you'd been married a year. Clement's mother loved you for that, and thought it was a sacrifice you were making so that Natalie could get married and go to India, and so that Clement could come down here and live near her. It wasn't a sacrifice, Lydia. Nothing matters to you so much as having the beau role. You can't bear anyone else to be in the foreground, and no sacrifice costs anything if it'll get you there. You sacrificed even Clement, over and over again." "How dare you speak like that?" Lydia was choking. "I've watched it for nearly 20 years, Joyce declared recklessly, "and I've not spoken. Once you told us, do you remember, that your grandfather had given you a rule, and that you'd kept it all your life, always to let the other people talk about themselves. And you did. You let the people that did love you, Clement, and good, simple Natalie Kennedy, and little Jenny at first, you let them all talk about themselves, and you listened, thinking all the time how superior you were to be able to keep your own counsel, and never give yourself away in return. And when you were sympathetic and said kind things about what they'd told you, they were grateful, and that pleased you because it put you in the position of giving, while they only took. But that sort of thing won't go down forever with sensitive and loving people. Do you suppose that Clement didn't come to know that there was nothing real behind all your patience, and your sympathy, and your listening? You liked to feel that he was dependent on you for something, that was all. You didn't really care for his little fiddling jobs about the garden, that Jenny loved instinctively. You didn't really care about the parish and the people, although you liked being the parson's wife and having them come to you for things. Clement found out what your sympathy was worth, and that his, in return, that he would have given you so lavishly, wasn't what you wanted, or ever would want. He fell in love with your pretty face and your quick wits, and with what he thought was your courage in going to work as a young girl in London. And he helped you, when I suppose even you, for once in your life, were frightened and in want of comfort. When you found yourself an ignorant and helpless child, on the verge of being mixed up in the divorce scandals of your employer. You'd got down to bedrock that time, I imagine, and needed someone human and warm-hearted like Clement to come to your help. "Don't mention his name to me again," cried out Lydia suddenly. "No, I won't. I've said my say, and if it's hurt you, Lydia, I'm glad. Not because I hate you. I don't know. Though I came very near it once when I saw Clement, first bewildered and not understanding what it was that you lacked, and then gradually realizing what I'd realized long ago, that you care for nothing and nobody on earth, except as it affects yourself. Joyce, as she had told Lydia, had said her say. The two women faced one another in dead silence for another moment. Then Joyce Damerel turned and left the room. Lydia, sitting huddled in a chair beside the window with eyes that conveyed hardly any message to her stunned mind, saw her sister-in-law's tall figure walking away swiftly across the garden. She was left alone. Jenny and young Valentine were out together. The house was curiously silent. So that was what Joyce thought of her. Did it matter? Joyce and she had never liked one another, and Joyce's opinion did not really count for very much. Only gradually was Lydia's inner vision able to focus the real point at issue. Were these accusations true? Falteringly, and very, very slowly in its deepening anguish, her mind took a long journey back through the years. Through a dim, childish era, when she had proudly resented her mother's widowhood to which her own orphanship must be subordinated. She had hardly regretted her mother's death at all, partly because it had freed her from the capricious tyranny of weakness, principally because it had left her undisputed the first right to consideration and compassion. Through the inauguration of her life in the little Regency Terrace household, she had known all the time, even as a little girl, that Aunt Evelyn was silly and snobbish, Aunt Beryl limited and provincial, Uncle George pedantic with his perpetual Mr. Barlow monologues on uninteresting subjects, their old friend Mr. Monteagle Almond a pompous and narrow-minded little bank clerk who had never made any success of his life. They had been very kind to her, had admired and praised her cleverness without stint as without discrimination, and had trustfully displayed their real characteristics to the little Daniel come to judgment, who had always listened and responded so intelligently and gently. She had taken what they offered, keeping her own counsel all the time, and inwardly criticizing and despising them. But Grandpapa had known all the while. One could not doubt for an instant that Grandpapa's shrewdness had penetrated through all the good behavior and proper deference of the little girl Lydia, to the acute self-interest that had actuated the good behavior and the deference. Grandpapa had known. Perhaps at first it had amused him. His teaching had not been of tolerance or humility, but of bracing self-repression and self-advancement. There's no such thing as cant. Don't give everything a personal application. It bores people. But later on he had been less amused and more contemptuous. Was it of Lydia's methods? Slowly her thoughts took her through the long-ago school days at Miss Glover's. Ambition had made her work, and the stimulus of admiration. But there had been human relations there too, surely. Across Lydia's memory flitted a long, half-obliterated procession of Mollys and Doras who had walked up and down the gardens with her, arm in arm, pouring out the stories of school quarrels, school adventures, school tragedies that filled the horizon for them. You won't repeat this to a soul, Lydia, ever, will you? I can trust you. Oh, yes, Lydia could be trusted never to repeat the long-involved histories. Repeating only meant trouble for the talebearer. Natural shrewdness and fastidiousness combined had prevented her from making any return confidences. Always let other people talk about themselves. Then they were in the weaker position at once, and forever. Lydia had tacitly accepted the obligations of these implied friendships, but she had felt herself all the time to be vastly superior to them. Through the school years still, to the arrival of Natalie Palmer, the girl from Devonshire, manners, dress, accent, all slightly different from those of the town girls at the school. Making friends with Natalie had been eminently worthwhile, and her wholehearted admiration pleasant. And Natalie was so generous in her recognition of Lydia's infinite superiority of brain and personality that it was possible to indulge from time to time in the occasional luxury of self-expression with her. The friendship with Natalie had survived their shared school days, given fresh impetus on Lydia's side by the consciousness that the gray-headed, distinguished-looking rector, the devoted father of Natalie, had approved of her clever schoolmate and suggested that later on she should come and stay at the Devonshire rectory. The end of school, and a catastrophe that still loomed large on the skyline of Lydia's memory, illness on the very verge of the examination that was to crown so many minor honors. Even the pitying attention so lavishly bestowed upon her had not atoned for that calamity, especially when so much of it, unprecedentedly, had diverged from herself to Aunt Beryl, a sudden rival claimant to illness. On and on through those old past times, the visit to Wimbledon, and the intolerable bouncing, boisterous Senthovens, even Lydia had only been able to endure, garnering what profit to herself was possible from their slangy, elliptical instruction. More than mere endurance would have been impossible. And, after all, no need to assume sympathy or admiration in the case of the loud and self-satisfied Senthovens. They took tribute to their prowess for granted, wanted no demonstrations. "No nonsense about us," they cried. Nevertheless, the Senthovens had been ready enough with shouted congratulations and boastings, and had made ungrudging jubilee over Lydia's success, to them so incomprehensible and unattainable, in the great school examination. Lydia remembered quite well how the news had come, and rescued her from her humiliating standing as the spoil-sport of the party who had clumsily contrived to hurt Olive Senthoven in a game of cricket. It had also distracted all the attention from Olive and her bruised face, and focused it upon Lydia, rescuing her once and for all from the ignominy of her position amongst the Senthovens. After school days and the Senthovens, her bid for independence and London. Backwards still through the days of that early bewildering experiment. From Elena herself, that peroxide blonde of such astute experience, to the pallid young ladies in the millinery, Lydia's personality had made conquests of them all. How freely they had giggled and gossiped before her, and eventually poured out their confidences just as recklessly as the little schoolgirls at Miss Glover's. In those days Lydia really had admired her own diplomacy that had so quickly established her as general favorite in a community with which she really had so little in common. Shrewd, pale-faced Rosie Graham didn't matter. One had thought she did at first, because she had brains and acumen, and something in her very scornfulness itself was oddly alluring. A certain attraction about Miss Graham, until measured by the standard of importance applied to one's first affair with a man. Margoliouth, his oily and uninspired pawings, there was no other word for them in the retrospect, had certainly roused no ardor in Lydia. It had merely been agreeable to feel herself the center of speculation amongst the matrons and spinsters of Miss Nettleship's boarding-house. And competent to take care of herself in the accepted sense of the words, Lydia had discreetly permitted the Greek's advances, conscious all the time of the prestige accruing to her from theatre expeditions, handsome cab drives, gifts of violets, and boxes of Cadbury chocolates. She had viewed as a safeguard her own perfectly distinct inward determination that Margoliouth should never be allowed, in return for these favors, to overstep the limits set by Lydia's careful sense of discretion. Disaster and humiliation had threatened the termination of that episode, the first hint of which had been Miss Nettleship's plaintive and nervously spoken warning of the Greek gentleman's inability to meet his bills. A worse revelation then, and a more public one, had been that of Mrs. Margoliouth's unexpected existence. Pain had really threatened then, had hung like a descending cloud above Lydia's humiliated head. But her secret boast had been that, after all, she had turned that defeat into victory. The victory of a fine attitude that had won her a great deal of admiration and a pity that was not condescending from all the spectators of the little sordid drama. It had also brought her an odd revelation that she remembered still, the conviction that there was no calamity without its available compensation in the shape of a not at all discreditable notoriety. Through the phases of her youth still, the writing of her story and the introduction that it had brought her through voluble Miss Forster to the unforgettable Lady Honoret. Certainly her wit and determination had made the very most of that introduction, aided by the curious success that her novel had achieved. A side issue, Lydia envisaged also the fact that she had ceased to write when success in writing had ceased to have any value for enhancing her position amongst her surroundings. The writing, like everything else, had only been a means to an end. Backwards through that faraway summer holiday that she had maneuvered to obtain at Natalie's home in Devonshire, gratifying at once her love of gratitude and her desire to justify her own careful schemings by inducing Aunt Beryl to receive Miss Nettleship in her stead at Regency Terrace. Then the delight of making a success in her new milieu, of knowing that admiring Natalie and the simple-minded rector were full of praise and thanks for the able help that she had so soon learnt to give them. Certainly they had had the assistance that her quick brain and nimble fingers could bestow, but the things they had given her were things of the spirit, affection and trust and loyal admiration, and for these they had met with no return in kind. Was it that Lydia was incapable of them? Joyce said that Clement had come to recognize it. With the remembrance came shudderingly and reluctantly, but with relentless inevitability, the linking up of the past with the present. Clement, who had puzzled and almost angered Lydia by his gradual transition during their married life, from eager confidences and ardent demonstrations to strange, apathetic reticences, Clement lived on in his daughter Jenny. That which she had never acknowledged to herself for the sake of Clement, for whom her love had been a tepid thing, undeserving of the name, Lydia was coming to recognize for the sake of Clement's child. Jenny was the first person whom Lydia had loved, and as Rosie Graham had predicted long, long ago, she had not known how to set about it. Loving Jenny, she had yet, as Joyce Damerel said, taken all the greater things for herself, and left Jenny only the less. For herself, the beau role; for Jenny, that of foil. Across her ravaged perceptions tore yet another recollection, one that this time seemed to summarize them all. She heard again Grandpapa's thin old voice with its cynical intonation. "You're a situation snatcher, Lydia. That's what you are. A situation snatcher." Grandpapa had known. End of Chapter 26. Recording by C.J. Plogue.
Chapter 27 of The Heel of Achilles by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mama, the telegram has come. Rolland has 10 days leave. He'll be in London tomorrow. Jenny's voice held a kind of awe in it, as though the unbelievable had come to pass. "I'll take you there," said Lydia curtly. The concession had been made on the evening in September, when Jenny, coming in from an afternoon spent with her lover, had found Lydia huddled in a chair by the window of the drawing-room, with fixed, vacant eyes and chilly hands. But although Lydia had in no sense nor smallest degree revoked that half-spoken sanction of Jenny's engagement that had been inwardly forced upon her in the midst of the hour of truest misery that her life had ever known, she could derive no comfort from Jenny's sudden, unregulated outbursts of jubilant gratitude. "Oh, Mama, you'll take me to London." "I told you I would when he got leave. He wants the wedding immediately, of course." Jenny nodded. "If he has 10 days, you can be married quietly in town by special license, and see him off when he has to go back." I want to be married from here," said Jenny quickly. "Just go up with you to meet him and do perhaps one day's shopping or two while he gets the license and the rings and things, and we go and see the old lawyers and people, and then come back here for my wedding, and go somewhere in the country for a tiny honeymoon till the last possible minute." Lydia was surprised. "It'll be much more tiring for you, a lot of rushing about like that." Her instinct was always to shield Jenny from Jenny's self. "Roland wants it to be like that, too." The defiant gleam of one who expects opposition had come into Jenny's eyes again. "Don't, Jenny, take that tone. I'm not saying you shan't have it your own way. Why do you want to be married here, and not in London, which would be so much simpler?" "It's my home," cried Jenny, "and besides I want to have all the people I can. Even if I have got to be married in a traveling dress and without proper bridesmaids or anything, I may as well have some fun. We don't know any people in London." She spoke like a child, Lydia reflected. And yet, when they met Roland Valentine in London 24 hours later, Jenny no longer spoke like a child. She was quite different, infinitely more reposeful, gentler, more womanly. Was this the real Jenny? Lydia's perceptions were far too acute for her not to know that it was with Roland, not with herself, that Jenny was at ease, and therefore was absolutely natural. Roland Valentine himself pleased Lydia better than on any former occasion. He, too, was graver and more quiet, and he thanked her very earnestly for giving her consent to an immediate wedding. Then went to lawyers, to banks, to jewelers, and innumerable other shops, and Roland procured the special license, and Jenny's strong, sunburnt finger was measured for the wedding ring. The ring was to follow them to Devonshire by post. Something was to be engraved inside the gold circlet, but Lydia was not told what it was to be. Jenny had never been secretive or even reserved, but it never seemed to occur to her to give her mother her confidence now, any more than she had ever given it to her in the course of the last 7 or 8 years. Lydia, although she had been aware of this before, had never suffered from it as she suffered now. Formerly, she might have told herself that Jenny had no confidence to bestow, that nothing lay beneath the surface. Now, she was slowly, and with infinite pain in the recognition, forced to concede to Jenny the existence of a definite and individual personality. Jenny, the potential woman, as distinct from Jenny, Lydia Demerel's child. On the day before that of their proposed return to Devonshire, Jenny unexpectedly demanded whether they could not look up Aunt Evelyn and Aunt Beryl. "I've seen Roland's relations, the only ones in England at least, and I think he ought to see mine." "So he has. He's been at Quintmere, and he knows your grandmother and Billy." Lydia had not the slightest desire to look up the Senthovens, and once more there was the instinctive conviction that what Jenny suggested for herself could not be the best thing for her. "That's just it," said Jenny. "He says they all make him feel like an adventurer down there. It's so old and sort of traditional. I know just what he means. So I want him to see what awfully ordinary sorts of relations I have, as well as people like Granny and Aunt Joyce." The recollection flashed across Lydia's mind incontinently of the care with which she, engaged to be married to Jenny's father, had avoided any such display of relatives and their ordinariness. However, Roland Valentine, the Canadian mechanic, would scarcely prove critical. Lydia sent a prepaid telegram to Regency Terrace and received Aunt Beryl's laconic reply. "Delighted." The short, familiar journey was thronged for Lydia, in her new mood of painful introspection, with such memories as it seemed to never have held before. Jenny and Roland Valentine sat opposite to her in the train. They talked to one another in low tones, and every now and then looked into one another's eyes. It seemed to Lydia that, even in the gaze of the young man who had already been at the front for more than 3 months, there was no apprehension of parting, only the ecstatic recognition of an immense bliss. She felt herself overwhelmingly lonely. Regency Terrace, as usual, looked astonishingly unchanged. One almost expected to see Grandpapa's head at the bow window of the dining room behind the lace curtains, to hear Shamrock's shrill, eager barking on the steps. Aunt Beryl wore a dark blue skirt and a flannel blouse with a high collar, just as she had worn every winter ever since Lydia could remember her. "Come in, dear. I'm ever so pleased to see you. How do you do, Mr. Valentine? I'm quite well, thank you. Well, Jenny, I declare." Aunt Beryl looked at Jenny with an open adoration that she had not conceded even to Lydia in Lydia's younger days. "Aunt Evelyn is in the drawing-room, and Olive. It's a great piece of luck having Olive here. She's doing VAD work at our Belgian hospital in King's Road, and she's got the afternoon off. Tell Aunt Evelyn that you think Olive's looking better, Lydia, if you get the chance. She's awfully down on the poor girl for wanting to do this work. She says she isn't strong enough and will knock herself up. It's only because we know the matron that Evelyn let her go there at all." Aunt Beryl shook her head and conducted them into the drawing-room. If Jenny wanted Roland Valentine to appreciate the fact that she possessed relations who might be described as ordinary, Lydia reflected that she must surely be satisfied now. Never had the Regency Terrace household exhibited such a perfect apotheosis of the commonplace. Olive, in a dark blue uniform that made her look extraordinarily flat-chested, sat on a stool crouched over the fire, her face unbecomingly heated. Aunt Evelyn was in the armchair that had been Grandpapa's, but it, too, had been drawn close to the narrow grate, behind which burned a piled-up mound of coal, constantly replenished by Olive from the scuttle. Mrs. Senthoven had visibly aged, although her sister had not. Her increasing deafness compelled her to carry an ear-trumpet that gave her an air of infirmity, and she wore a cap over her thin, parted white hair and a little knitted shawl across her shoulders. With a sort of shock, Lydia realized that Aunt Evelyn must be past 60. They had to shout at her, for she would not always make use of her ear-trumpet. "Mother does hate that old trumpet of hers," said Olive in explanation. "I tell her she ought to see some of the things our men in the hospital have to put up with. Artificial legs, glass eyes, and goodness knows what all." Olive could talk of nothing but the hospital. She had only been working there a month. "This sister, I can tell you, Sister McGregor, as she calls herself, she's a terror. A great big woman she is, and wears the scarlet and gray uniform, you know. Well, what do you think men call her? She's a thumping great piece, I must tell you, as broad as she's long, and that's saying something. Well, the men call her the Thin Red Line. Isn't that great now?" Roland Valentine shouted with laughter, and Jenny laughed too. Even Aunt Beryl, to whom Lydia felt sure that the story could not be new, displayed a sympathetic mirth, and Olive's mother inquired querulously what the joke was. "It's an old one, Mother," screamed Olive. "You've heard it already." "But what was it?" persisted Evelyn suspiciously. It was Roland Valentine who picked up the trumpet and loudly repeated it into Olive's successful anecdote. Soon it became evident that the introduction of Roland to Jenny's family was to be crowned with success. The young man talked about Canada to Bob's mother, and was shown the photograph of Bob, and Bob's wife, and a fat boy in a kilt, who was explained as my daughter-in-law's only child by her first. She was a widow when Bob met her, but the boy is a nice little fellow, I believe. No second family, I'm sorry to say. But Mother has plenty of grandchildren," Olive announced, half proudly and half aggressively. "Have you seen this one of poor old B's young hopefuls, Lydia?" It was a large group, 6, 7 swains ranging from the ages of 15 to 8½ The girls had frizzed-out hair and wore cheap lace collars over their stuff dresses, and the 2 youngest, both boys, were in velveteen suits, and one grasped a spade and the other a bucket. The photographer had indicated a seascape behind the group. "Regular swains, aren't they?" said Olive discontentedly. "Not a Senthoven amongst the lot of them, at least not in appearance." "Why hasn't this fine little fellow here got a look of his auntie?" inquired Roland Valentine, indicating the least unattractive of Mrs. Swain's progeny. Olive looked gratified. "Funny you should say that. He's my godson, Horace, And he is a good bit more like our side of the family than any of the others. Not that the others take after their father in anything but looks, I will say." "Don't you like him, then?" inquired Jenny innocently. Lydia had not thought fit to enter into any details before Jenny as to the little she knew of Beatrice Senthoven's disastrous alliance with Mr. Stanley Swain. She had indeed systematically evaded all Jenny's inquiries about her contemporary cousins. "Like him?" said Olive explosively. "Hark at her, Lydia. Why, he's a bad lot, Jenny, that's what he is, a regular scallywag. You know." An expressive pantomime of a tilted-up arm and hand, and a motion as of swallowing, completed Olive's terse description of her brother-in-law's failing. "Ah, a lot of good fellows get their lives spoiled that way," said Valentine sympathetically, but quite matter-of-factly, thought Lydia. "Him and Beatrice ought never to have been allowed to go about together the way they did," said Aunt Evelyn suddenly. "I blame myself." Now, tell us all about this wedding of yours, Jenny," said Aunt Beryl, violently tactful. "A regular war wedding, isn't it?" said Olive. "One of our nurses at the hospital the other day got a telegram just like that to say that her fiasco was coming on leave, and that they were getting married straight away. So this girl I'm telling you about, this nurse, she went straight off with 24 hours leave. That's all they'd give her, if you please, and simply came back married." "Only 24 hours?" exclaimed Jenny. "What did the husband do?" "Oh, came down with her, of course, and stayed at the hotel." "Well, I think it was too bad," Aunt Beryl remarked with finality, "only giving her 24 hours like that. Poor thing." "One's got to think of the work," said Olive, shaking her head. "We're fearfully full up just now. I wonder you don't take up nursing, Jenny, but perhaps you mean to after you're married." "I don't know," said Jenny calmly. Then she had had some such idea, although Lydia had definitely stated that she was not fitted for such work, and had taken it for granted that Jenny would come home to her after Roland's return to the front. Lydia had far too much self-command to risk a betrayal of her thought by looking at her daughter, but she knew by intuition that Jenny had shot a half-frightened, half-mischievous glance at her in a schoolgirl fashion. "I'd like to have Jenny doing work in London somewhere," declared Roland Valentine. "It'll be handy for my leave, or if I get sent into hospital." "We might find a flat in town," said Lydia quietly. "There are all sorts of hostels for women workers being opened everywhere," said Jenny. The implication was obvious enough. At 4 o'clock Olive rose importantly. She had been glancing surreptitiously at the clock for the last 10 minutes. "Well, I suppose I must be toddling. What a bore," she said with an affection of reluctance. "It's as much as my place is worth to be 5 minutes late in going on duty." "I told the girl to put a cup of tea for you in the dining room, dear. You've plenty of time." "The girl I've got now," said Aunt Beryl in parentheses to Lydia, "is the best I've had since Gertrude left. You remember Gertrude, who got married." "How are you going, Olive?" "By tram, I suppose." "Perhaps you and Jenny would like to walk with her as far as the tramway centre," suggested Aunt Beryl with a kindly gleam of rather pallid mirth directed at the Canadian. "Sure. Will you, Jenny?" "Come on, then. Goodbye, Auntie." "Goodbye, Lydia, old girl. Awfully glad to have seen you, especially in these busy days. Ta-ta." Olive clattered from the room, quite in the old breezy Senthoven manner. "She won't be back till 10 o'clock tonight, as likely as not," moaned her mother. "She's looking very well on it," declared Aunt Beryl stoutly. "Lydia, don't you think Olive looks ever so much better for the interest?" Lydia agreed with complete sincerity. Aunt Beryl sat down by the fire, and there was a certain relaxation as from a long strain in her bearing. "Those are the lucky ones, those that have a job. There's poor George eating his heart out because he's past the age for even the volunteers. It does seem hard, too. All he can do is to stay overtime at the office doing the work of young fellows who've gone to the war. Lydia, that's a fine young chap that Jenny's got there." "I'm glad you like him, Aunt Beryl," said Lydia gently. Her tone held no hint of disagreement. To disparage her accepted son-in-law would have offended her taste, besides mitigating her claim to self-sacrificed motherhood. "Dear little Jenny, she's full young. but you weren't much older when you married yourself, Lydia." "Nearly 3 years, and Jenny is such a baby for her age." Lydia held tenaciously to the theory of Jenny's tardy development because it seemed to exonerate her from some of the charges that she could not forget, brought against her successively by Roland Valentine and by Joyce de Merrill. "She'll mend of that fast enough in these days, poor dear." "Besides," said Aunt Beryl thoughtfully, "I don't know that she's so much of a baby, Lydia. This engagement will have steadied her, too. I could see a great difference. Evelyn, don't you think Jenny much less of a child, more grown-up like?" "What, dear?" "Tell Lydia whether you don't think Jenny much more of a woman since she's been engaged," screamed Aunt Beryl. "Oh, yes, poor little Jenny. The world's all being made over in this awful war. It's only the young things who count for anything now." "She hasn't heard," said Aunt Beryl to Lydia, shaking her head. But the observation of the deaf woman had not been so irrelevant, at least to the thoughts that surged into Lydia's subconsciousness. Only the young people counted now. It was they who, in every sense, stood in the forefront of the battle now. "Oh," said Lydia, in sudden, overwhelming need of a vent for the intolerable misery that was surging within her, "I can't bear to think of my little sheltered Jenny suddenly rushed into the realities of life like this. If only I could bear it all for her." "Ah, yes, I expect you feel that," said Aunt Beryl with a strange matter-of-factness. "I would so gladly take it all for her." Even as she spoke, Lydia realized the full truth of the words. How much easier it would be, how far less costly to herself, to know Jenny ignorant and happy, while she herself, a recognized victim, faced a suffering that would be rendered entirely bearable by that very fact. "I'm sure it's very hard to sit by and see others suffer," said Aunt Beryl tritely, and added in the same rather monotonous voice, "I was very fond of your mother, Lydia, and I remember quite well thinking how much easier it would have been when your poor father died, if I could have had the pain of it all to myself, instead of having to feel for her, and Aunt Evelyn there as well. There was a sort of selfishness in it, like, I dare say." "Aunt Beryl," said Lydia suddenly, "should you say that I was selfish with Jenny?" "How do you mean, dear, exactly?" There was nothing in Aunt Beryl's voice that showed her protesting, as Lydia inwardly craved that she should protest at the mere suggestion. "Then you do think so?" "No." "Oh, no, Lydia, I shouldn't say that, dear." They both glanced at Mrs. Senthoven. She had fallen into a doze and was nodding over the red fire. Lydia's misery drove her to a form of self-revelation utterly foreign to her. I've been worried lately. Joyce, my sister-in-law, who has never liked me, began to talk about Jenny the other day, and she sounded as if she thought that my very love for Jenny was something selfish, had always been selfish. It upset me very much. And she wasn't even logical, Aunt Beryl. She said I'd never cared for anyone but myself, and in the same breath accused me of caring for Jenny selfishly, as though I hadn't lived my whole life for Jenny since her father died. After all, I was quite a young woman when I was left a widow. I might have married again. I have sometimes wondered, dear. Of course, living quietly in the depths of the country, I practically never saw anyone, but all the same I could have married." "I dare say that would be so, dear. But don't you see, that would have meant that Jenny could no longer be my first consideration, and I've always put her first, Aunt Beryl, always." "She's grown up a very dear girl, I'm sure," said Aunt Beryl expressionlessly. "If she were marrying someone we'd all known and liked, and there wasn't this horrible war hanging over it all, if I could only feel that she was going to happiness naturally and normally, then I could bear losing her. It's the lot of parents, and I'd face all my loneliness gladly, if only I didn't feel that some awful loss or grief may be coming to her that I shan't be able to take in her stead. Well, of course, you know, dear, Jenny has to live her own life." Aunt Beryl had spoken colloquially, without emphasis. She had repeated the verdict already voiced crudely by young Valentine and vehemently by Joyce. They thought that Lydia grudged Jenny, had always grudged her, the right of experience. Lydia had never held Aunt Beryl's opinions in high esteem. Indeed, they were very few opinions so to hold. One talked with Aunt Beryl of the people one knew, of household difficulties and of clothes, never of abstract questions nor of inner perplexities. One knew instinctively that for such she would have no solution to offer. And yet Aunt Beryl's simple statement that Jenny had to live her own life carried with it to Lydia an altogether disproportionate dismay. To see one's own child suffer, it's far worse than suffering oneself, she reiterated helplessly. I'm not saying it isn't hard on you, dear. Aunt Beryl softly picked up the little knitted shawl that had slipped from Mrs. Senthoven's shoulders and replaced it without waking her. I'm sure it isn't good for Aunt Evelyn to sleep in the daytime the way she does, Lydia. It isn't what I call wholesome sleep either. Hark at the way she's breathing. Aunt Beryl reseated herself. About what we were saying, dear. No doubt you'll say me being an old maid, I can hardly enter into a mother's feelings, and probably it's the case. But I always remember that time years and years ago, Lydia, when you went off to London, to that Madame Elena's, that shop. I always remember what a way I was in about it. Feeling you were too young, you know, that someone ought to stand between you and the world, and so on and so forth. You know the way one goes on, dear. And then something or other set me thinking, and Mr. Monteagle Almond and Uncle George and I got talking one evening, I remember, and it seemed as though it would be more myself I was thinking about than you, really, if I insisted upon you being kept under my wing, as they say, instead of letting you learn for yourself. Of course, said Aunt Beryl apologetically, I'm not saying it's the same thing as being a mother, you understand, but it does seem as though one ought to be ready to let the young people suffer for themselves, so to speak, if that's the way they're going to learn. But I want to see my Jenny happy, said Lydia piteously. I suppose there's no real happiness without there's been sorrow, too, said Aunt Beryl simply. Her speech had never been free from provincialisms, such as Lydia had instinctively known all her life how to avoid. If you can reach the bell without getting up, Lydia, I wish you'd ring, dear. I'm trying to train the girl to be a bit more punctual with tea of an afternoon. She's very bad that way. She could start laying, and then wait the teapot for Jenny and Mr. Valentine. I said tea up here this afternoon, so as to save a fire in the dining room. I thought you'd understand, dear. Of course, said Lydia, hardly hearing. I suppose they'll be back in a minute. Oh, Aunt Beryl, if only I knew what was best for Jenny. I should let her judge for herself, dear. Truly I should, said Aunt Beryl placidly. It may hurt you more just to stand by and watch, but it'll be better for her in the long run to have been let learn her own lessons. There was a curious stability about Aunt Beryl's point of view. Lydia did not feel that she could hope to modify it, however mildly it might be reiterated in homely and uneloquent phrases. You mean that I've got to sacrifice Jenny for Jenny's own good? The door of the drawing-room opened. You can start bringing up the tea things, Gladys, said Aunt Beryl. Don't make the tea until the young lady and gentleman are in. They've left the door on the jar, but in case you don't hear them, I'll ring. Yes, Miss Raymond. Gladys went away again. She's quite a smart-looking girl, isn't she, Lydia? Said her mistress complacently. And one doesn't have to keep nagging all the time. She's thoroughly willing. You were saying, dear, that you ought to sacrifice Jenny for her own good, but I don't know that that's exactly how I'd put it myself. It's more sacrificing yourself that I meant, sacrificing your own feelings, like. Another echo. Roland Valentine had said, it's only another kind of sacrifice that's wanted. The way you can do it best is just the way that'll hurt you the most. Let her take her own risks and shoulder her own responsibilities. Yes, it was just the way that hurt Lydia most. No doubt of that. That's the hall door. If the water's boiling, really boiling, mind, Gladys, you can make the tea and bring up the hot toast. Aunt Evelyn woke suddenly. Tea already? She said eagerly. I must have closed my eyes. It's a shame Olive couldn't stop for a nice cozy tea by the fire before going out. She had a cup in the dining room, dear. Gladys had it all ready. And a piece of cake. "I don't like this mad way of scamping her meals," said Aunt Evelyn dejectedly. "Fancy that now, Lydia. A bitter wind like today, and there's Olive will come home on top of a tram, as like as not, with her chest and all, at 9 or 10 o'clock tonight." Aunt Beryl firmly picked up the ear trumpet, adjusted it, and spoke through it with vigor. "Olive's all right, Evelyn. You know the doctor said she could try for a bit, and she was wild to do something for the war. She'd have fretted herself to fiddlestrings if she hadn't got this job." They both of them spoke, Lydia thought, with a little amusement, as though Olive were quite a young girl instead of a middle-aged woman. As Aunt Beryl's shrill voice ceased, her sister nodded her head reluctantly. "Well, well, it's a terrible war, and I wish I were good for anything besides knitting. Though they say the boys out there can't have enough woolies, but it would be easier to go out and do the hard work oneself, if only one could, and leave the children safe at home, like when they were little. I expect you are beginning to feel that, Lydia. It's the way of the world now, and we must just make the best of our shelf now we're on it." Aunt Evelyn even laughed a little, but Lydia felt as though the whole world were in league against her. End of chapter 27. Recording by C.J. Plogue. Chapter 28 of The Heel of Achilles by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. They did not go down to Devonshire until the middle of the following day. Lydia had the whole morning to herself, even after she had finished packing up her small suitcase and Jenny's. This time Jenny had made no protest when her mother began to pack for her. She and Roland had gone out together quite early, and although Lydia thought that they had told her of their destination, she seemed able to remember nothing but the essential fact that they were to meet her at the station at 1 o'clock. In the meantime, she felt an urgent need of occupation, and remembered an apologetic request of Aunt Beryl's. "I don't know whether you could ever recommend poor Maria Nettleship's rooms to any of your friends, Lydia, but it would be a real kindness. The boarding house has been giving her ever so much trouble lately, and then this war coming. One doesn't know how things will be, and she hasn't got much put by, I'm afraid. I never hear from her without she asks after you in the letter, you know. She's never forgotten you, and if ever you're up that way, I know it will give her real pleasure to see you, but of course she understands you're busy." So far as Miss Nettleship was concerned, Lydia had been busy for many years. Now, however, half curious and half listless, she found herself in the old Bloomsbury neighborhood. Looking up at the tall house, Lydia supposed that it was unchanged, but such a lassitude had crept over her perceptions that she seemed to herself utterly incapable of summoning any vivid recollection to her mind. Should she go in? She felt little inclination to do so, but it would please Aunt Beryl, and anything was better than to remain alone with one's thoughts, and expose oneself perhaps to a more active realization of certain apprehended truths. Europe was at war. Jenny was going to be married, a mere baby, to a young Canadian who cared nothing for the traditions in which she had been brought up, who upheld her ungrateful defiance of her mother, and would, if he lived, take her right away. No one left. Natalie thinking of her husband and her boys, Lady Lucy thinking of her young grandson, the only male Damerel left, gone into the fighting line. No one giving a thought to Lydia, save Lydia's racked and bewildered self. She shuddered involuntarily and rang the doorbell. "Miss Nettleship?" "Will you step into the drawing-room?" said the maid. She preceded Lydia upstairs, pulling down the sleeves of her dress as she went. "I'll tell Miss Nettleship if you'll take a seat." Lydia heard her clattering downstairs again. No doubt Miss Nettleship was in the basement, supervising the activities of a successor to someone whom she had invariably alluded to in the old days as "poor old Agnes." Lydia actually smiled a little as her surroundings recalled old, forgotten details of the boarding-house life. The drawing-room was still furnished in yellow. The heavy gilding of the mirror over the mantelpiece seemed only slightly more chipped and tarnished. There was no fire, although it was cold. The smell of distant, greasy cooking still hung in the air. On a small shelf in a corner were some very dirty and tattered numbers of The Ladies' Realm, Molly Bond, devoid of the cover, and the novel written nearly 20 years ago by Lydia herself. Time worked very few changes at Miss Nettleship's house in Bloomsbury. Lydia looked up when the door of the drawing-room opened, feeling sure that she would have no difficulty in recognizing Miss Nettleship, although it was nearly 6 years since they had last met on one of Lydia's infrequent expeditions to Regency Terrace. But in effect they were strangers to her who entered the room, although a curious sense of familiarity seemed to indicate that the type was not new to her. Both ladies were middle-aged, both looked pinched and cold and shabby, and both gave Lydia the same furtive, hesitating bow as they passed. They took their seats on either side of the empty grate and talked to each other in low, discontented murmurs. "It's too bad not to have a fire a day like this, with the dining-room smoking so that one can't stay in the room. She said she'd have the fire in here lit after midday dinner. I thought I'd tell you, Mrs. Morrison, knowing how bad your chest has been, so that we could slip out of the dining-room early and get 2 nice chairs and keep warm all afternoon. Otherwise we know who will get the best places." "Oh, yes, it's always the same. Selfish, I call it. Thank you for the hint, Miss Perry. I shall make the most of it. I suppose it isn't anywhere near dinner time yet?" "Oh, no, only just gone 12. "Is that all? I thought breakfast very poor this morning, didn't you?" "Downright robbery, considering the money we pay. It isn't at all the sort of thing I consider one has the right to expect in a residential private hotel, either. The porridge burnt, and all the toast finished if one's so much as 5 minutes late. Old Mr. Kinch thinks nothing of helping himself to 2 pieces at once. I've seen him do it, and one doesn't like to say anything." "Certainly not. It isn't the food one cares about, but it's the principle of the thing. Miss Nettleship ought to stop it, you know, but of course, there it is. He's a permanent let and doesn't care what he pays. Naturally, she won't risk losing him." "Oh, naturally. Why, they say he thinks nothing of ordering in wine for himself, and fruit out of season. Of course it's good for the house, I suppose, seeing things delivered at the door like that from West End shops. Miss Forster, Mrs. Clarence, ancient Miss Lillicrap with her heart disease, the old forgotten ghosts all crowded back upon Lydia's memory. The dingy walls of the drawing-room had encompassed the same conversations about food and lack of warmth and grasping fellow boarders year in and year out. "They say this war is going to affect the price of food, and there'll be things we shan't be able to get any more." "Ah, things we've been getting from Germany, I dare say that would be," vaguely said the spinster Miss Perry. "I should have thought we could make anything here that the Germans could make, I must say." "Not at the price, though," said Miss Perry sagely. "They've been making a regular business of cheap trades, you know. That's part of their cleverness." "Ah, I dare say. They say the Kaiser had all this war planned out as far back as the old Queen's death. How he can sleep in his bed at night, I can't imagine." "Perhaps he can't," said Miss Perry darkly. "I couldn't, in his place, I know that." "Oh, nor could I." The ladies fell silent, perhaps each imagining herself in the unenviable position of the potentate under discussion. Lydia felt sure that such a flight of fancy was well within the humorless capacity of each. When the door opened again and Miss Nettleship came in, very fat and panting a great deal, but otherwise unchanged, Miss Perry and Mrs. Morrison watched with furtive eagerness her enthusiastic greeting of Lydia, whilst pretending to conceal themselves behind the loose sheets of an illustrated paper. The uncertain movement made by Mrs. Morrison towards the door was forestalled by Miss Nettleship, however. "Come into my room for a little chat," she begged Lydia. "I've a sitting-room now, besides the office." The sitting-room was a small back bedroom hung with cheerful red twill curtains and almost entirely filled by an armchair and an old-fashioned sofa, designated by its owner as the couch. "Take the couch, won't you? It's a nice, comfortable seat, and I'll have the room warm in a minute." Miss Nettleship knelt down upon the floor, not without difficulty, and applied a match to a small gas fire. A fierce yapping sound ensued, and then a pale blue flame appeared, gradually extending the length of the grate, and began to glow, sending out an amount of heat that seemed to scorch up the air in the tiny room, in spite of the shallow pan of water standing just in front of the gate. Lydia, in a strange, detached way, reflected that it was a long while since she had sat in the dry, odorous heat of a gas fire. At Regency Terrace they made use of smoking coal. In Devonshire, most of the hearths that she knew burnt sweet-smelling wood. Miss Nettleship assailed Lydia with a flood of eager and interested questions. She seemed to know by name and reputation everyone belonging to the family of Damerel, and inquired solicitously for Lady Lucy, anxious for news of her grandson and compassionately for his mother. At Lydia's replies she nodded her head, fixing upon her round, absorbed brown eyes, and saying from time to time, "Of course one sees how it is, Mrs. Damerel. I quite understand." It all seemed curiously unchanged, even to Miss Nettleship's old phraseology. And Miss Nettleship's memory. She recalled names and incidents that seemed to Lydia to have been delved out of some other life, and all with a comfortable assurance that Lydia would remember even as she herself did. "You'll want to hear of the people who were here in your time. Let me see now. Well, Miss Forster, then, of course. Did your auntie tell you about her? I remember I wrote to her about it when the accident happened." "What accident?" "Oh, poor thing. She got run over in the street and died in hospital. About 5 years ago, it must have been. She'd left here, you know, and gone into rooms. But I went to the inquest, of course. Naturally I did," said Miss Nettleship with mournful pride. "She'd put on a lot of flesh, poor thing, and it was quite a shock to see how stout she'd grown. She often asked after you, you know." Lydia had not known. It surprised her again and again to hear of the extraordinary fidelity with which so many of these people, in their limited circles of interests, had remembered her. "There was that old lady who had a weak heart, Miss Lillicrap. What happened to her?" "Poor Miss Lillicrap. She was old, you see, and ill, and one couldn't say much, but you know how it was." "She lost me some very good boarders," said Miss Nettleship, shaking her head. "It was always the same thing at the dinner table, you see, grumbling at the food, and yet taking more than her fair share. I had to tell her that her room was wanted at last, and she must leave. I never heard what happened to her, but she went away very angry, and left a lot of extras unpaid. You wouldn't believe the way people think nothing of leaving their extras unpaid, Mrs. Damerel." Miss Nettleship sighed, and Lydia wondered if she was thinking of Margoliouth. "Let me see. Who else did you know?" "The Bulteels." "Oh, yes. They went out to B.C., and I heard from Mrs. Bulteel once or twice. I believe the son, Mr. Hector, did very well out there. Mr. Bulteel died about 10 years ago, but the widow and Mr. Hector stayed on in B.C. And talking of the colonies, there's someone you used to know gone out to Australia. Time does fly. It must be nearly 5 years since she was here." "Who?" "A Mrs. Prince, she was, with a little boy. But she told me she'd known you before she married. It was remembering you that sent her here when she wanted rooms in London for a bit. Graham, her maiden name was." "I don't remember." "She was at a place of business on the West End. Elena's, it used to be called. It's changed hands now." Miss Nettleship delicately refrained from recalling Lydia's own connections with the shop. "Rosie Graham, the little cashier." Lydia remembered well enough now. Of all those elusive figures that peopled the forgotten past, Rosie Graham had remained by far the most vivid. "Oh, did she go to Australia, really? Why?" "She was married to an Australian. Ever such a nice fellow," said Miss Nettleship, her kind face beaming. "They'd only been married a couple of years, and she wasn't very young by any means, but they were so happy together, it was a treat to see them. They'd a dear little child, too, and another one on the way. I got a card from her after they'd gone to Sydney, saying the baby was a girl. I never heard any more after that, but I'm sure they're happy. He was such a nice fellow, and they were so fond of each other." "I'm glad she's happy," said Lydia, rather to her own surprise. "I never imagined she would marry, though. I never knew she was engaged." "Oh, she told me they hadn't been going together for very long before they got married. Quite well to do he was, and she wouldn't have to go out to work, though I believe women in Israel do all their own housework always." but Mrs. Prince was as pleased as anything at going off to Sydney. "I must say I do like to see what I call a real love match," said Miss Nettleship in a tone of satisfaction. Lydia looked at the stout, overworked woman with her graying hair and the wrinkles round her brown eyes. Those inexpressive, kindly eyes that actually seemed to look out with pleasure and interest still on a world that was narrowed to the dimensions of the Bloomsbury boarding house. As though in answer to her unspoken thought, Miss Nettleship turned to the eager expression of her own solicitude for Lydia and Lydia's concerns. "Of course I've heard about your daughter going to be married. She does seem young, but that's the way nowadays, this war. But I hope you're pleased, Mrs. Damerel." "He's a colonial, too, a Canadian," Lydia replied indirectly. "So your auntie told me. Well, I'm sure he's very lucky. But he's out at the war, with this machine of his, isn't he? It'll be hard for her to see him go off again after the wedding." "Yes, for both of us. I've so wanted little Jenny to be happy." Miss Nettleship made a clicking sound with her tongue, expressive of sympathy. "It is sad for these young people to start life like this. When one thinks of all the boys killed and wounded, and the girls working so hard and losing their brothers and sweethearts and husbands. Oh, Mrs. Damerel," said Miss Nettleship earnestly, "sometimes I've thought it hard to be all alone the way I am, and just have myself to work for. But when I think of what the wives and mothers of our soldiers are going through, I realize that I may have been spared something I couldn't have borne, and I'm thankful to have things the way they are." So that was Maria Nettleship's unsubtle, uncomplicated point of view. She could be thankful because she was out of the swirling current of life's deepest emotions, safely set aside in undistinguished security upon the bank. Not for her the strange, twisted anguish with which Lydia resented the sight of even pain and renunciation in which she had no share. Not for her the envious craving to be once more in the grip of dramatic circumstances, to hold the center of the stage once more, and garner experience wholesale that might only be doled out grudgingly to a younger, more trivial generation. Lydia left Miss Nettleship feeling that she had received only one more proof that her own spirit stood in a very desert of isolation. They none of them understood, could ever understand. It seemed to her that she lacked even the words in which to make her misery clear to them. They none of them spoke the same language. For them, sacrifice meant personal suffering. For Lydia, it meant standing aside, being denied the importance of personal suffering and the exploitation of it. They thought that those were to be pitied who were bearing the brunt of pain and privation. But Lydia knew that the pity and the pride and the sympathy made up for all the pain and the privation. She clenched her hands and sweat broke out upon her forehead. In the losses of her childhood, the struggle of her girlhood, in her premature widowhood, had she ever suffered as she was suffering now, when no one recognized her claims to impassioned pity any more? Lydia knew that for the first time in all her life she was really suffering. She felt as though something within her were being killed by agonizing inches, something that would not die. If once it died, the suffering would be over, and she herself left shattered, no longer keenly sentient, but it would not die. She met Jenny and Roland at the station, and they got into the train together. On the journey, it penetrated to her understanding for the first time that the marriage was to take place on the next day, but one. Monday? That's the day after tomorrow. But, Mama, Jenny gave her a quick, alarmed glance, we always did say Monday, if it could be managed, and I asked Aunt Joyce to see if it would be all right about the church that day, and she wired back yes. I showed you the telegram yesterday evening. I'd forgotten, said Lydia. She saw Jenny look at Roland Valentine with a piteous, scared expression, and presently they began to talk in very low tones together, carefully avoiding a glance in her direction. She understood that something in her looks or her manner was making them anxious. Mama, Jenny whispered when they had at length reached Clyst Milton, and while Roland was in search of a missing suitcase, he won't come home with us. He's going straight to Quintmere, and we'll only meet at the church tomorrow, and when we go to Granny's for lunch. You and I will have the evening all by ourselves tonight." Jenny was trying to make up, evidently, for what she thought was her mother's pain at losing her. She was very gentle and quiet when they parted from Roland, who came with them no further than the threshold of Lydia's cottage. "They'll put up the pony in the Quintmere stables for tonight, and we can drive it back after lunch tomorrow. The man will understand. We'll see you at church." Jenny slipped her hand into his. Lydia realized that they were foregoing some of their few hours together in order that she might have Jenny to herself for one evening. "Good night," she said curtly, and then abruptly into the house, leaving them alone for their brief parting in the winter darkness. Jenny that evening seemed tired, and Lydia, in her own immense fatigue that was so infinitely more of the spirit than of the flesh, half unconsciously resented the slight, unwanted shadows beneath her daughter's eyes and the pallor of her young face. Why should Jenny, the invariably robust, elect to look tired tonight? Then Lydia remembered how much shopping and walking and traveling and interviewing had been crowded into the last 2 days for the girl unaccustomed to London, and her heart smote her. If Jenny's fatigue was physical, there was nothing to resent. She was entitled to it. Lydia followed her usual methods and said gently, "Would you like your dinner in bed? I can bring it to you myself and sit with you afterwards." "You are tired too, Mama," said Jenny quickly. "Much more tired than I am, I think. Let's just have dinner early and then sit in the drawing room over the fire, all quiet and comfy, just you and me." She looked at her mother wistfully, as though seeking to make instinctive amends for she knew not what. During dinner they spoke of the wedding arrangements, of Jenny's hastily selected trousseau, and of the rooms secured by Lady Lucy at a North Devon fishing village for a brief honeymoon. Jenny grew excited. The slight look of strain left her round childish face, and she talked eagerly about her plans. "I'll telegraph to you, Mama, what day I'm coming back here. Of course I shall go to London with Roland to see him off." Jenny's lips suddenly quivered at the allusion, and she talked faster than ever, and in the old, rather arrogant strain, as though to reassure herself by a display of great self-confidence. "I don't know exactly what I shall do eventually, you know, Mama. I think I ought to find some war work, and Roland would like me to be in London, and of course it would be the best place in case he got wounded or when he gets leave." "If you were working, you would be tied down to certain hours, I suppose, like your cousin Olive," said Lydia. "You remember what she told us about her hospital." "Oh," said Jenny airily, "I'd stipulate all about that beforehand. There must be other work besides hospital work." Lydia could not help wondering for what work untrained, inexperienced Jenny thought herself fitted, and she knew that something of that wonder was showing in her face. "I must learn to do things now," said Jenny, as though in an answer to Lydia's look, and coloring hotly as she spoke. The defiant note had crept back into her voice, and the vexed consciousness of that animated Lydia's reply. "Certainly. Up to now I don't think you've been very willing to be taught, have you, Jenny? But you know that you can attend classes even down here, now that they're getting up so many of these Red Cross and other things. And if you want to learn practical, everyday usefulness, I could at least teach you housekeeping." Lydia was perfectly aware of forcing an issue, and some imperative desire to lessen the sudden tension of the atmosphere made her rise from the dinner table as she spoke. They went into the drawing room in silence. When they were seated on either side of the fire, Jenny with empty hands, and Lydia stitching at the embroidery on some of Jenny's new underwear, Jenny suddenly spoke. She was never diplomatic, poor Jenny, and a far less acute hearer, and one much less familiar with her every intonation than was the observant Lydia, would have known that her hasty, nervously spoken speech was premeditated. "Wouldn't it be rather fun, in a way, as I can't have a proper home of our own with Roland until the war is over, for me to find a tiny flat or something in London, and make it all nice and live in it, and you could come up and stay with me, Mama, when you want a day or two in London? Is that your idea or his?" "I suppose both of us planned it together. I wouldn't let Roland say anything to you about it. I wanted to tell you myself." Jenny looked at her mother with unconsciously imploring eyes that beseeched her to receive, at least in silence, a decision which both of them knew to be epoch-making. But Lydia herself could no longer control the bitterness that had been swelling within her for many weeks. "You'd rather live by yourself in London, in fact, and cope with difficulties of which you haven't the slightest idea, whilst I stay alone down here, than let us be together during these miserable times of anxiety? Naturally, with the understanding that I shouldn't dream of being there when there's the slightest chance of your having Roland at home. Is that it?" "Oh, Mama, but isn't that what you mean to tell me?" "Oh, don't," said Jenny miserably. "Don't go on making exclamations that mean nothing. What you're really saying is that you don't want me to have anything to do with your new life, isn't it?" Lydia's voice was iron. With every word she was lashing at her own pain as well as at Jenny's, but some inner force beyond her own control was driving her on. "I didn't say not anything to do with it," burst childishly from Jenny. "But if it wasn't wartime, Roland and I would be going to Canada most likely, and then I'd have to leave you, and everybody would think it perfectly natural. You know they would. The cases are not parallel. I am not suggesting, and never should suggest, making a third in your married life. Those are not arrangements that can ever succeed from anyone's point of view. But you know perfectly well that the circumstances are not normal. Roland will be away from you until the war is over, and your natural home, the home of your childhood, is still here. I am still here, to receive and care for you until you begin your real married life. However, you say you don't want that care and that shelter. You prefer to be alone in London, and to let me be alone down here." The expression of Jenny's face whilst her mother was speaking had hardened from the pleading apprehension of giving pain into a sullen self-justification. The tone of her voice corresponded to her look when she spoke. "It isn't fair to talk like that, as if I was deserting you. I can't stay always tied to your apron strings, Mama. In fact, even if I wasn't going to be married, I'd practically decided to go away and do some war work somewhere, whatever you said. Oh, can't you understand? When you were my age, you went away to London and worked, and there wasn't a war or anything then." "The circumstances were very different," said Lydia coldly. "I was living with an uncle and aunt, and expense was a very serious consideration to them. You know very well that everything I have in the world is yours, and that my only wish has been to take care of you and keep you good and well and happy." "Then," said Jenny swiftly, "you ought to be glad for me to do what I like, and what Roland and I both think is best for me. I've got to develop into a responsible grown-up person sometime or other, I suppose, and how can I ever do it when all the time you're shielding me from everything, and only wanting me to be, as you say, good and happy, like a little baby?" The irrepressible gibe sprung to Lydia's lips. "That's what Roland Valentine has taught you to think?" Jenny looked straight at her mother. "He's given me the courage to say it," she retorted in a voice as hard as Lydia's own. "But I've been thinking it and feeling it for years and years, and I've been miserable at home." The unforgettable words that could never be unsaid had been spoken between them. In a flash of unutterable misery, Lydia knew that it was too late for the self-control, the pity, the abnegation that might have saved the final open contest that never now could be as though it had not been. As though the veritable physical abyss yawned between them, the mother and daughter stared at one another aghast, with wretched, incredulous unhappiness. The lines of Jenny's young face broke first, and she burst into pitiful, tempestuous sobbing and crying. "Mama, Mama, forgive me. I didn't mean it. Oh, don't look like that. I was wicked and ungrateful. I didn't mean it. I'll do anything you like." But Lydia knew that her belated victory held for her no promise of good. All night long she lay open-eyed and tearless, and for a long while she could hear at intervals from the bedroom next to her own the muffled sounds of Jenny's unrestrained, childish crying. End of Chapter 28. Recording by C.J. Blog. Chapter 29 of The Heel of Achilles by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "What have you been doing to Jenny?" asked Joyce Damerel next morning, in her manner that so oddly mingled disagreeableness with a sort of friendly interest. Lydia was not in the least surprised by the question. Her own wakeful and wretched night had left no such traces as were plainly to be seen in the unaccustomed rings around Jenny's eyes, and the heavy swollen look of young eyelids unused to tears and to vigils alike. Jenny must have been crying almost all night. "She got overtired in London," Lydia said unemotionally. "She was thoroughly upset last night." "Poor little thing." Joyce sought for no further explanation. It was evident. But Lydia knew, quite as well as though she had been within earshot of the lovers, what had been Roland Valentine's first startled inquiry when he and Jenny met outside the church porch. And after the two had walked across the fields together to Quintmere, whither Lady Lucy drove Lydia, she was aware of a new hostility in Roland Valentine's manner to herself. The words of the night before, Lydia told herself with a strange apathy, were destined to echo long and far. She wondered dully how they had come to speak them. Why she, with her lifelong instincts of self-control, had madly, at this 11th hour, brought about a crisis that Jenny, the child, had so obviously tried to avert. Her perceptions were so dulled by the suffering of the last few months, culminating into the breaking point of yesterday, that she heard hardly anything of the conversation at lunch, and herself took part in it quite automatically. It seemed to her that Lady Lucy looked at her compassionately once or twice. "This is a trying time for you, my dear," said the old lady kindly, when they found themselves alone together in the drawing-room later on. "But you must think of dear little Jenny's happiness, and trust that the infinite mercy will bring her husband back to her at the end of this cruel war." Lydia smiled faintly, listening to the gentle platitudes that were the means of expression most natural to Lady Lucy's spirit of quiet fortitude. She thought that the turbulent depths of her own wretchedness could never be even apprehended by her mother-in-law. Without being aware of it, however, Lydia had reached those last outposts of endurance when mental anguish must have the relief of speech, or plunge into the abyss of madness. Because she could bear Lady Lucy's kindly, simply commonplaces no longer, Lydia announced a sudden intention of walking home. "Before tea?" protested Lady Lucy. "I couldn't hear of it, my dear. Besides, the Kennedys are coming up this afternoon, and the dear old rector." Quite suddenly, the remembrance flashed across Lydia of the day that she had first told Natalie and her husband of Roland Valentine and his pretensions to become engaged to Jenny. The Kennedys had been thinking only of the war then, and of their own two boys. They cared little enough for Jenny's romance, but still less for Lydia's state of mind on the subject. But the rector had looked at her. Lydia remembered the look with odd distinctness, and the impression of an understanding almost apprehensive in its completeness that it had produced upon her. She had hardly seen the rector since that day. Had he perhaps understood? "I should like to see Mr. Palmer and Natalie," she murmured mechanically. "Oh, yes, and besides, you must drive back. The pony and cart are ordered for 5 o'clock, as I thought you would want Jenny to be early. Poor little girl, she looks pale and tired today, but I'm sure that's very natural. Even in ordinary times a girl is apt to look worn out with all the excitement and the preparations just before the wedding." Lady Lucy talked on, and Lydia stared out of the window. It was a bleak, windy day, with scudding clouds flying across a dark sky. Perhaps they would say it was too cold for the rector to be out of doors, and Natalie and her husband would come alone. If so, Lydia felt that her last hope would have failed her. She looked at the clock. It was not quite yet 3, and they would probably not arrive before 4 o'clock. Waiting had become unendurable. "Where is Joyce?" she asked, wondering if it could be borne, were she obliged to sit tete-a-tete for another whole hour with the old lady, who would resent any pretense at reading, when she was desirous of talking about the morrow's wedding. "I think she went to see about poor little Solomon, my dear. You know Solly feels the cold weather now he's getting to be an old dog. Joyce has had his basket put by the fire in the housekeeper's room. We've got some stuff for his poor eyes, and he can't bear anyone but Joyce to put it on." The placid old voice rambled on and on. It seemed to Lydia ages and ages before she ventured again to look at the clock. It must have stopped. The hands didn't even yet indicate 3 o'clock. "That clock is fast, my dear," said Lady Lucy. "It isn't more than 2:45, I feel sure. This new man comes up from the village on Saturdays now doesn't seem to understand the clocks in the same way that young Davy did. You know young Davy is actually at the front now. His mother had a field postcard last week. Everything crossed out except 'I'm quite well.' You've seen those curious printed field postcards, I suppose, haven't you?" The sound of Colonel Kennedy's newly acquired 2-seater was heard outside quite early in the afternoon, long before 4 o'clock. Nevertheless, it seemed to Lydia that she had lived through a lifetime of waiting that afternoon. The quivering nerves of her mind, wrenched to the point of uttermost tension, had with almost irrational intensity fixed upon speech with old Mr. Palmer as the one forlorn hope of relief. She clenched her hands upon the arms of her chair, while the sounds of arrival in the hall outside penetrated to the drawing-room. "How nice and early they are," said Lady Lucy. "Will you ring the bell, my dear? Natalie will be glad of some tea after that cold drive. I'm sure her father won't have ventured out of doors in such an east wind." Lydia cast upon her a look of affrighted anguish. What did her mother-in-law mean by so calm a prophecy of a disaster that now presented itself to Lydia's disordered perceptions as one of almost incredible magnitude? The door opened and Natalie came into the room with Joyce Damerel. Colonel Kennedy alone followed them, and the door shut behind him. The rector had not come. "Father was disappointed, but we didn't dare to risk it. The wind has gone right round to the east. He wanted so much to see Jenny, too, Lydia, but he wouldn't run the chance of catching cold before the wedding. My dear, the church looks lovely. They've decorated it all. Where's Jenny?" "They're both in the library," said Lady Lucy with a significant smile. "Oh, well, we shall see them presently. I suppose all the preparations are finished, Lydia? You look very tired. Was there a great deal to do?" "Quite a lot," said Lydia, and smiled faintly. They went on talking all around her. Colonel Kennedy spoke about the war news, and the others listened to him anxiously, with the deference accorded to the opinion of an old soldier. News of Billy Damerel and of Alec and Charlie Kennedy was exchanged between Joyce and Natalie. Old Lady Lucy talked about the family of Belgian refugees installed in the village. Poor things! One was so dreadfully sorry for them, and still is, but they are very difficult to please. The mother and the aunt quarrel terribly, and the aunt wants to be sent somewhere else. How do you find yours, Natalie?" "Not at all easy to manage either. They grumbled so at having to drink tea that the committee has had to arrange a special supply of coffee for them. And Monsieur Mertens came up the other day and told us it was such a bad coffee that it was making his wife ill. He said she was irréversible, but Dr. West couldn't find anything wrong with her." "That's just it. One of ours, that young chemist from Antwerp, says he spits blood up every night and is going to die, but he seems as well as possible." "I suppose," said Colonel Kennedy tritely, "that we have the worst specimens over here. The decent ones, the men, at all events, are fighting." Lydia heard it all without attending to it. So many similar conversations had been held at Quintmere and elsewhere since the war. Tea was brought, and Jenny and Roland Valentine came in together, and the talk was then altogether of the wedding. It seemed that for Jenny's sake everyone was anxious not to recall the war by the mention of anything connected with it. "It's so nice that you should have it here, Jenny, and not in London. Everyone's so pleased that you've decorated the church. We looked in as we came up to leave some flowers." "Have you any more presents, Jenny?" "Some lovely cut glass from Roland's aunt in Oxford. It's in the library. Grandmama is letting me have everything sent here." "I can pack it all up myself and send it anywhere you like afterwards," said Lydia, almost from force of habit. She saw herself toiling over the wearisome task when Jenny had left her, gone away to her new life. "We can all help," said Joyce Damerel briskly. "Or perhaps Jenny would like her things to stay here until she comes to fetch them herself." With the faintest possible start, Lydia realized the intention, hostile to herself, of the little speech. Joyce had never liked her. "I think we ought to start," she said suddenly. "Natalie, will your father be in if I go round that way?" Natalie looked rather surprised. "Oh, yes. Shall I take a message, Lydia, if it's anything about tomorrow?" Lydia heard herself utter a disagreeable laugh. "No, it's nothing to do with Jenny, or with Jenny's concerns. I want to speak to the rector." She could not herself have told when the wish had crystallized into a determination. "Will you ring Roland, if you please," said Lady Lucy quietly, "and order the pony cart to be brought to the door?" When they left Quintmere, the old lady solemnly kissed and blessed her granddaughter, and Joyce, most undemonstrative of women, put her arms around the girl for a moment. Natalie, her soft blue eyes full of ready emotional tears, let them fall unabashed as she said, smiling, "Till tomorrow, Jenny darling." No one gave a thought or a look to Lydia, except Roland Valentine, and his eyes were like steel. "You can drive, Jenny." The girl took up the reins. "Do you really want to go all that way round by the Kennedys, Mama?" she asked presently. "Yes, I do," Lydia replied with a stubborn inflection in her voice that she herself heard with surprise. It was as though any questioning of that decision would rouse in her a veritable frenzy, but Jenny made no attempt to question it. They drove almost in silence. "I'll wait outside with the pony, or shall I come in?" Jenny asked rather timidly. "Wait? No, don't wait. It's cold. Drive on, and leave the pony at the inn as usual, and go home as quick as you can. I'll walk." "Oh, Mama." "What's the matter?" Lydia asked sharply. "Won't you be tired?" "No," said Lydia inflexibly. She always disliked any display of thoughtfulness or anxiety on her behalf from Jenny. It seemed somehow to minimize her own self-abnegating maternity, and to assert on Jenny's part an unfounded claim to maturity. "Then please come back fairly early. It'll be our last evening, at least the last before tomorrow," Jenny pleaded confusedly. The personal claim Lydia could not only tolerate, but it touched her strongly and suddenly. "Yes, yes, my darling, go home now." The words seemed to break up some constriction that had hitherto bound her, and even as she watched Jenny turn the pony's head obediently, and heard the sounds of the wheels recede, Lydia became aware that a violent rush of uncontrollable tears suddenly threatened her. "Is the rector in, Alice?" she asked the maid, and heard with horror the quivering of her own voice. The rector was in the study. Lydia had only to cross the hall and open the familiar door, but before she entered the little lamp-lit room her face was drenched with tears. She pulled down her veil in desperation. "Lydia," said the old rector in pleased surprise. Then his face altered pitifully. "Who is it?" he stammered. "Not Natalie? Not one of the boys?" No, only myself. It's nothing. I mean, nothing has happened. Only I can't bear things any longer. I thought perhaps you'd understand. I had to speak to someone." The sound of her own incoherence, by its very unfamiliarity, served to destroy Lydia's last defenses. She sank into a chair and wept wildly and bitterly, as she had never in all her life wept before. The rector stood still for a moment and looked at her, and then walked slowly with a careful gait of age and obesity to the door. "Alice!" Lydia heard him call. "Alice!" I am engaged with Mrs. Damerel, and do not wish to be disturbed. Please tell Colonel and Mrs. Kennedy when they come in. Thank you, Alice." He closed the door and came slowly and carefully back again to his seat in front of the writing table. His attitude was one familiar to Lydia, and indeed to all those who knew him. One knee crossed over the other, his hands lightly joined together, his chair turned sideways to the light that fell from the little reading lamp upon his thin gray hair and kind, simple face that held little of learning or of great shrewdness. Lydia had never looked upon him as a very wise old man. He had lived in her house for a number of years, had been often unpunctual and untidy, and always apologetic for both failings, and also always grateful to her for letting him remain on in his old home after it had virtually become hers and Clement's. He had spoilt Jenny and his own grandchildren when they came home from India, and his weakness and lack of judgment had often made Lydia's work with Clement in the parish unnecessarily difficult. Lydia, in common with everyone else, had often said of him, "The rector really is a saint, too good for this world." She had only meant that the old man was unpractical, behind the times, and yet too well-meaning and conscientious to be unkindly criticized by anyone. She had never sought spiritual counsel of him. It was not in her nature to feel any need of such a thing, and although she would have thought it wrong, without analyzing wherein the wrong would lie, to omit any of the customary religious exercises to which she had been brought up, it never in her life occurred to her, and would not occur now, to connect what she supposed to be religion with such an emotional crisis as she was at present passing through. As to many another before her, the one was a poignant and present reality, the other a meaningless convention that slipped away with all other conventions when the bedrock of life was touched. It was not for the possible comfort or guidance to be found in religion that she had come to the rector, whose halting, ineloquent sermons she knew almost as well as she did himself. She had come merely because the breaking point had been reached. There was no one to understand, and her wild, forlorn, last hope centered on this old man from whom she had never heard a word of condemnation of anyone. End of chapter 29. Recording by C.J. Plogue. Chapter 30 of The Heel of Achilles by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. "Poor child, poor dear child," said the rector. "I'm so miserable," cried Lydia, like an unhappy child. Yes. Is it about little Jenny?" She answered brokenly and with incoherent vehemence the accumulated suffering of the past months, finding vent in disconnected words and sobbing elliptical phrases. She scarcely knew what she said. Jenny was going away from her, marrying a man who hated her mother, and who thought and was teaching Jenny to think that all her life she had been tyrannized over. Roland Valentine had said outright that Lydia had made Jenny afraid of her. Joyce had been cruel too. She had accused Lydia of not knowing what love meant and having disappointed Clement and done her best to spoil Jenny's life. No, my poor child. She said I wanted the beau role for myself always, that I would only let Jenny have little trivial things, that I grudged her the experience of reality. Lydia broke off and gazed at the old man with terrified eyes, seeing no protesting denial in his face. "It's the tendency of us all," he said dreamily. "We grudge the young folk the privilege of suffering and learning. We seek to shelter them for the sake of our own peace of mind, and call it devotion. But, stammered Lydia, to love anyone is to want to protect them, to save them from pain, to bear it instead. I have loved Jenny. God knows I do love her. My care for her and over-anxiety and perhaps over-solicitude have all been love." "Love," said the rector in the same dreamy, monotonous voice, as of one voicing a conviction too intimate for vehement upholding. "Love is suffering. whether it is love for man or woman or child, for husband or wife, little child or dear friend. Always remember that, Lydia. Love is suffering in this life. It is only afterwards, when we have mastered the truth and accepted all that it implies, that no doubt there is some further stage, undreamed of by poor humanity, when the suffering is all transmuted and love becomes joy. Slowly a dim understanding of the words seemed to come to Lydia. Oddly and not irrelevantly, she remembered once more the pronouncement of the little girl who had worked with her in a London shop 20 years earlier. You've never cared for anyone. When you do love somebody, you won't know how to set about it. Was she learning now, for the first time? No longer wrenched by the hard sobs of her despair, she continued to gaze at the old, unlearned man, so much less well equipped for life than she had seemed to be herself. "Do you know, my dear," said the rector in a tone of gentle narrative, "what always strikes me as the most sublime illustration of the true love that is suffering? One has seen it reproduced in Roman Catholic churches, although I do not know if they give it any special significance. It is generally only one of many little pleasures placed around the church, and it represents the Virgin Mary's meeting with her Son on his way to Mount Calvary." Lydia felt bewildered and almost disappointed. Did the consciousness of his profession oblige the rector to try and turn her thoughts thus? Here was no revealing formula, such as she had half hoped might throw a new light on all that perplexed and tortured her, but merely the old allusion to the great figure of Christianity that, for Lydia, held no real relation to the problems of life. "It isn't religion I want," she said dully. I believe in it all, of course, but it doesn't seem to help me now in this." "Lydia, my dear child," said the rector in a tone that seemed to hold a little surprised admonition, "I am not in the pulpit. I am not speaking as a priest. Nor at this moment am I urging upon you the consolations of religion. Later on you will seek and find for yourself, perhaps. I am not asking you to look at the divine Lord, but at the human Christ, and at his human mother. Think of them as two figures of mythology, if you will, or as two figures in some great tragedy of which we have all read. And ask yourself if there could have been such suffering without such love without such suffering." He looked at her fixedly for a moment, and then went on speaking very slowly, as though giving her time to form to herself some mental image from each of his halting phrases. "Think of that meeting between Mary of Bethlehem and her Son. To her he must have been still the little child of Nazareth, for whom she had no doubt done everything that other mothers do for their little children, whom she had loved and guarded and cherished, whom she had lain in the tiny, poor little manger at Bethlehem, whom she had carried before her on the back of the ass during the flight into Egypt, safe in her arms. During the 3 years of his ministry, no doubt, they were much separated," said the rector in the same simple narrative manner, "but there must have been many times when he came back to her. For instance, they were together for the festival at the marriage of Cana. She knew about his work, and I feel sure that they talked about it all together. Think, my dear, what it must have been to a mother to meet her son like that, on his way to be tortured and put to death like a malefactor, the blood and the sweat all streaming down his face, and carrying on his shoulders that heavy cross. She must have felt then that it would be a million times easier to suffer it all herself, don't you think? It would have hurt her far less, surely. And she went up the hill, too, my dear, and stood by the cross and saw it all. I trust that there is nothing irreverent in the idea that her suffering must have surpassed Christ's. One knows very well," said the old rector, "that it is less painful to endure bodily anguish than to watch it endured by one's beloved." Lydia uttered a stifled, startled cry. "But that is love, to find it easier to endure one's self than to let one's beloved endure. It is a stage of love," the rector acquiesced gently. "And beyond that?" asked Lydia fearfully. "Beyond that, there is a greater immolation. that of relinquishing the privilege of suffering to another, and accepting the pain of watching that suffering. There is a certain strong sense of inner conviction that strikes, with a pang as that of birth, through the very soul, and which is experienced but once or twice in a lifetime. Such a pang struck through Lydia now. It was this, then, that they had all been trying, in their varying degrees, to tell her. Jenny, with her inarticulate, struggling rebelliousness, that held all the blundering ungraciousness of a young, blind thing, still unaware of its own objective. Roland Valentine, with his strong personal resentment on behalf of his love, and his hard New World standards of independence. Joyce Damerel, with her narrow, inflexible judgments, and personality antagonistic to Lydia's. Old Lady Lucy, with the conventional shibboleths of her creed and her generation, that yet stood for selflessness and high courage. Aunt Beryl, with her simple, matter-of-fact statement of a truth evidently accepted by her without question. Jenny has to live her own life. It's more sacrificing yourself that I meant. Sacrificing your own feelings, like. They had all meant the same thing. Even silly, ill-advised Aunt Evelyn, grumbling at the tardy independence of her middle-aged daughter, and yet acquiescing in it with the rueful finality. We must just make the best of our shelf now we're on it. Even when, incredibly enough, poor, forgotten, unaltered Maria Nettleship, with her uneloquently expressed realization of having been spared the strange, paradoxical, immeasurable suffering of love, that in the ultimate analysis meant the relinquishment of suffering to the beloved. "That is all, my dear," said the rector gently. Lydia had heard nothing of what he had been saying, although she had been aware of the kindly, monotonous old voice, talking on in careful, halting sentences. Her every faculty had been absorbed in the tardy revelation that was at length hers. As her mental equilibrium slowly swung back to its habitual poise once more, the fundamentally practical outlook that would always be Lydia's asserted itself. "But it's too late now. Jenny is going away from me tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" repeated the rector, almost maunderingly. Voices became audible in the hall outside, and Lydia knew that the Kennedys had returned. She could even conjecture from the murmur of the maid Alice's voice that the rector's message had been given to them. The sounds dispersed and ceased altogether. "I must go," said Lydia. "You have been so good to me. I was nearly mad when I came, I think. I can be braver now. I can be brave tomorrow." "Tomorrow," said the rector again. "Let tomorrow be Jenny's day." Some glimmering of his meaning brought a flash of irrepressible resentment into the inquiry of Lydia's gaze. "My dear child, my dear Lydia," said the old man apologetically, "let little Jenny have the foreground tomorrow. Let hers be the bravery, and the sacrifice, and the sorrow, and the gladness. It need matter to no one what anybody else feels or has to undergo. It need distract no attention from the child. Let it," said the rector pleadingly, "let it all form a background." Lydia understood. There was a conscious relinquishment, a displayed self-abnegation that would infallibly attract the sympathy and the compassion of all, and the compassion of all but the ultra-critical, that might not be hers. Very tentatively, perhaps guided more by instinct than by full awareness, the rector was pointing out to her the infinitely subtle atonement that might yet be hers. Tomorrow, her wedding day, to be solely Jenny's. After all, Lydia reflected with that strange clarity of mind that sometimes follows upon the extreme physical exhaustion induced by violent and unaccustomed emotion, those tomorrows when her daily life would be linked with Jenny's might be few indeed now. If the future was to hold crisis again for Jenny, as who could doubt, it might well be that she would choose to encounter her experiences alone. Let tomorrow be Jenny's, as nothing in her young life had yet been hers. And again another echo of words long since uttered by a more cynical, less kindly voice than that of the rector, brought a shadowy smile that held no mirth to Lydia's lips as she walked home through the darkness. Grandpapa, who knew, had called her a situation snatcher. Again and again the strange expression, grotesque to the verge of anti-climax, haunted Lydia. She thought of it as she entered her own house and heard the exclamations of the servant Susan. "Oh, ma'am, we've been wondering where you was. Miss Jenny been in quite a way. It's past dinner time, and knowing you were walking." "I was detained at Mrs. Kennedy's," said Lydia briefly. Jenny ran out of the drawing room. "Oh, Mama, I'm glad you've come. I was getting so worried, thinking of you out in the cold." Jenny stopped nervously, and Lydia knew intuitively that she was remembering her mother's old, implied claim to be the sole prerogative for all such expressions of concern. "I stayed longer than I meant to with the rector. He sent you his love." "Did he? Shall we have dinner now, Mama, or are you going to change?" "I'll change," said Lydia, and went slowly upstairs. She carefully removed the traces of weeping from her face before she came down again. The short evening was a very quiet one. In the drawing room Jenny sat with her cheek resting upon her hand, gazing into the fire. Once she said rather timidly, "The packing is all finished. Susan and I put the things into my dressing bag when I came in this afternoon." "It's a beautiful bag," said Lydia absently. The dressing bag had been Roland Valentine's gift. She remembered that she herself had been secretly disappointed at the time of her marriage because no one had given her such a thing, and she possessed only the plain wooden hairbrushes and clothes-brush, and the celluloid comb, that had figured upon her makeshift dressing table at Miss Nettleship's boarding house. And then Uncle George had given her a check, privately and almost shamefacedly explaining that it had nothing whatever to do with the 3-tiered silver cake stand that was to figure at the wedding as the joint offering of himself and Aunt Beryl. It was merely a trifle that he could well afford, with which to supplement her trousseau. And Lydia remembered that in her estimation the word trousseau had immediately become stretched as to include the smallest and neatest of silver-fitted dressing bags. The very next day she had successfully found and purchased the treasure. She generally had succeeded, Lydia reflected dispassionately. "There's no such thing as can't," had been another of Grandpapa's aphorisms, and his descendant for many years of her life had triumphantly proved the axiom in her own person. She had made people like and admire her. She had profited to the full of educational advantages. She had found work and successfully achieved it, had extricated herself unscarred and unblemished from various minor encounters, had made a marriage such as might well have seemed unattainable to Lydia Raymond, working in Madame Elena's shop, and even greater achievement had adequately filled the place open to her by that marriage. The record was to end there, it seemed. Lydia felt as utterly incapable of envisaging the rest of her life, the complete aloneness that seemed suddenly to have revealed itself to her, as of speaking aloud her thoughts to Jenny, motionless beside her. They talked very little, and it seemed to Lydia only of trivialities, although it was evident that Jenny attached some importance to her speculations as to the morrow's weather, the seating capacity of the little church, the extent to which choir and organist would do credit to the parish. "I do want it all to be perfect," was Jenny's candid aspiration. "I hope it will be," said Lydia tonelessly. "Are you very happy, Jenny?" "Yes," said Jenny simply, her gray eyes ecstatic. Then she looked at her mother and added wistfully, "I should be perfectly happy if only you were too." Lydia smiled faintly. She thought that she could appraise at its true value Jenny's obvious afterthought. Her fatigue was almost overwhelming, and to her own surprise she slept heavily all through the night. Then it was Jenny's wedding day, a clear, gray day without sunshine and without wind. Surprisingly enough, Lydia felt, one went through it with very little feeling of any kind. The emotion that struck most sharply at her consciousness was one of surprise that so long a waiting, so many preparations, should have culminated only in so brief an apotheosis. The wedding was over before she had adjusted herself to the expected pang of it, and actually very little impression of it all remained with her. The odd epithet that had rung in her ears since the day before rang there still, meaningless and yet strangely expressive. Situation snatcher. It even mingled senselessly in the farewells that rang all around her, when Jenny Valentine, took her leave of them all with her husband. "Goodbye. Good luck. Goodbye, dear Aunt Joyce, Grandmama, everybody. I'll see you all again in a little while. Goodbye, Roland. Take care of her." "I will, ma'am, you may be sure of that." Roland was bending over old Lady Lucy's hand. "Look here, dear, I won't want to hurry you, but you've only just time." Colonel Kennedy, of course, always a victim to train fever. "Oh." The bride flung her arms around her mother's neck. "It's only for a week, Mama," she whispered consolingly. "Thank you for giving me such a lovely wedding." The chauffeur started the engine of the waiting motor car, and its throbbing broke on the air and caused Jenny to detach her clasp from her mother. But she still faced Lydia with a pleading, puzzled look, her eyes tearful but lurking in their grey depths an unconquerable joyousness. "I must say something," Lydia reflected desperately, dully astonished at her sudden inability to find any words at all. A situation snatcher. No, the foolish term was an obsession. She had not been that, not now. She bent forward and kissed Jenny once more. "Goodbye, my child, you'll write." The chauffeur held the door of the car open, and Jenny's foot was on the step. She was within it, and her husband was beside her. Leaning across him, her fresh face at the lowered window, her bare hand with the new wedding ring gleaming upon it, grasped the door. A sense of wrenching open, as of vistas of finality, suddenly dispersed Lydia's apathy, and at the agonizing glimpse of her own bereft and isolated future, she found, as the car began to move slowly from the door, the habitual, instinctive self-expression that alone could drug her misery. "Goodbye, Jenny. I'll see to everything. Don't worry about letters or packing. I'll do it all for you whilst you're away." "Jenny is still waving," cried Joyce Damerel, and waved back again vigorously. But at the same instant Lady Lucy laid her tremulous old hand upon Lydia's, gazing at her compassionately, and Nathalie Kennedy exclaimed aloud, turning towards her, "Oh, poor Lydia!" The scattered groups of relatives and friends coalesced surrounding her. End of The Heel of Achilles by E.M. Delafield. Recording by C.J. Plogue.